Chapter 14. When the Reverend Father took refuge in his chamber after this fearful and memorable interview, he felt that strange mysterious sensation of something dreadful hanging over him, though he scarcely knew what, which so often weighs upon the mind when any great and unexpected change has taken place in our destiny. He threw himself upon a sofa, and endeavored in vain to analyze his feelings. He was not superstitious, but there was something about the mummy that inspired him with awe in spite of himself, and he felt that he was no longer his own master, for a supernatural power seemed to mingle with his designs, and control his actions. He endeavored in vain to recur to the plans he had that morning arranged for gaining over partisans to the side of Rosabella. He could not govern his ideas, he could no longer direct them as he wished. One sole thought occupied his mind, one sole image floated before his senses. He held his head with his hands, he pressed them firmly against his ears, and closed his eyes, as though by shutting out external objects his mind could recover its tone. It was all in vain. The gaunt figure of the mummy still seemed to stalk before his eyes, and his fiendish laugh still to ring in his ears. Father Morris rose from his couch and threw open his window. The cool evening breeze revived him, and restored his faculties. He now began to reason with himself. "It is very strange," said he, "but, unaccountable though it may seem, the destinies of this fearful being are evidently interwoven with mine. His appearance here at this eventful moment, and his forcing himself upon my confidence, which a secret power superior to my own prevented the possibility of my refusing him, cannot surely be accidental. No, he is permitted to revisit this earth for some positive and definite purpose, perchance to counteract my plans, perchance to aid them. There is no vanity in the thought, for upon my destiny, at this moment, hangs that of a mighty empire, and I feel that I am but a blind instrument in the hands of fate, condemned to work, more like, in the dark, uncertain whether I be not drawing destruction upon my head at the very moment when I fancy I am attaining the pinnacle of happiness and glory. However, I will not be wanting to myself, this strange agent may be sent to aid me, and it shall not be my fault if I do not avail myself of his assistance. In his present garb he creates disgust and terror, but clothed as a human being, his superhuman eloquence, and the strange fearful interest excited by his looks and manner, might render him a powerful assistant. It shall be my present business, then, to endeavor to make him serviceable to my views, and to do this I must persuade him to adopt the dress and manners of the country." Pleased with the resolution he had taken, and quite forgetting the lateness of the hour, Father Morris descended hastily to the usual sitting-room of Mrs. Montague, but what was his horror, on entering it, to find, instead of the usual cheerful party he expected, only the dreaded mummy. Cheops again lay stretched upon the couch he had before occupied, his eyes fixed upon the brilliant constellation of Orion, and his lips murmuring an address to the deity he fancied it to represent. "Yes, blessed Horus," cried Cheops, as Father Morris entered the room, "thou wilt hear my prayer, for thou hast also been a stranger in a foreign land, forced even in thy mother's arms to fly, pursued by all the fury of fell Typhon's rage. Thou knowest how to pity the unhappy. And thou too, bright Isis," continued he, addressing the moon, "thou also hast known sorrow, when thy streaming tears occasioned the first overflowing of the Nile, and grief for the loss of Osiris rent thy bosom with despair. Then becamest thou well fitted to be patroness of the wretched. O Arsinoe! Could I but recall the fatal moment when I saw thee last." "Despair is sinful," said Father Morris, who now stood beside him. "Repentance may obtain forgiveness even of the most heinous crimes." Cheops started upon his feet at the sound of the father's voice, and burst into one of his fearful laughs. "And who art thou," cried he, "who presumest to preach repentance to me? Oh! I know thee now, thou art the priest whose confidant I am become. But though I will aid thee, think not I will be thy slave, no, rather art thou mine, for thou art in my power." Father Morris felt his blood curdle in his veins at this address, and, though he strove to speak, his tongue clove to the roof of his mouth, and he could not articulate a word. Cheops saw his embarrassment, and continued in a milder tone, "Fear nothing, we may be useful to each other. I would fain quit these garments of the tomb, and since I seem destined to remain some time amongst your fellow men, I will endeavor to assume their manners. You seem to have influence amongst them, try, then, to pacify their fears, and teach them to regard me as a fellow being. At this moment the solemn clang of a deep-toned bell fell heavily upon their ears. Cheops started at the sound, and, springing from the couch on which he had reclined, bent forward eagerly to listen as it slowly pealed through the deep silence of the night. It was the great bell of the ancient cathedral of St. Paul, which told to announce that on the following day the body of the deceased queen would lie in state. "What is it?" cried Cheops, "whence comes that fearful knell, awful as the sound which is doomed to sink into the souls of the initiate of the Isian mysteries? Again it tolls, speak. Whence comes it? What does it foretell? Is it the signal of another change of existence, strange, awful, and mysterious, as that I have already experienced? Let it come, I am prepared. The gods cannot inflict tortures more horrid than those I already suffer. Cannot. Have I said? Dread Osiris, forgive the impious thought. Methinks e'en now I see thy dark blue countenance frowning in awful majesty at my unguarded rashness. Forgive me, mighty spirit. No longer will I repine at thy decrees, but teach my proud rebellious heart submission. Alas! Alas! Had I before done so. But it is now too late, and happiness is lost to me forever. Sighing, he hid his face in his hands as he spoke, and all again was silent, save the deep-toned bell, which still fell heavily at intervals upon the ear. Slowly the hours rolled on, yet still Father Maurice sate gazing on the mummy, till the first bright tints of morning broke through the dark grey sky, and a half-subdued bustle in the streets, as of people hurrying to and fro, announced that preparations were making to hang them with black. The confused murmur, the busy voices hushed to whispers, and the still continued tolling of the muffled bell, harmonized with the fearful form of the mummy visitant, which, now seen dimly by the uncertain shades of the breaking twilight, seemed to acquire fresh horrors from the obscure and wavering gleams thrown upon it. It was at this moment, when objects were gradually becoming more distinct every instant, that Lord Edmund rushed into the room. "Father Maurice," cried he, "you must aid me, or all is lost." And as he spoke, he started back aghast, for the terrific form of the mummy struck upon his sight. He had seen him, it was true, on his first descent, but the events that had since occurred, involving as they did the dearest interests of his soul, had almost driven the circumstance from his memory. Now, however, aided by the elusive light, the spectre appeared before him in all its frightful reality, and even the firm mind of Edmund shrunk back aghast from the appalling sight. "Why do you shrink?" said Cheops, his deep hollow voice thrilling through the souls of his auditors. "Why does my form appear to create such terror? Is it because a tomb has been my dwelling? Oh, degenerate race! Know that the sons of Mizraim, bold, wise, and learned as they were, held that communion with the dead was needful to the living. They loved to gaze upon the empty casket, deprived of all that gave it value, for it taught the meanness of the body, and who could dwell upon the withering worthless clay, and not acknowledge to his soul how poor were its highest pleasures, when compared to the sublime aspirations of the spirit? Why then tremble? Virtue need fear no spectres, and vice might shudder at itself. If thine own conscience do not upbraid thee, what hast thou to fear?" "Nothing," said Lord Edmund firmly, "spectre or demon, whatever you may be, I fear you not. 'Twas but the infirmity of human nature, it is past, and I am again myself, and strong in the consciousness of the integrity of my own mind. It is not in the power of hell itself to fright me from my purpose." "The integrity of thine own mind," cried Cheops, with one of his horrid laughs, "poor weak offspring of clay. Confide in thy boasted strength, rely upon thy vaunted firmness, but when the hour of trial and temptation shall arrive, tremble." Lord Edmund shuddered in spite of himself, and his blood ran colder in his veins. "Who art thou?" cried he, indignantly, "strange, terrible being that thou art, and why art thou permitted to revisit earth to taunt me into madness?" I was once as thou art, returned Cheops. Young, ardent, and impetuous, I thought the world was made for happiness, and that men were born to be my slaves. Glory was my idol, and fame the only meed I coveted. Deeply did I drink of her intoxicating cup, my renown spread to the remotest corners of the earth, and my power became as boundless as my ambition. To immortalize my name, I caused the erection of an enormous pyramid. And my grandeur seemed beyond the reach of destiny to destroy. But I trusted in my own strength, and I fell. Tremble then, weak man. Nor dare to boast how thou wilt act until the moment of temptation shall arrive. The deep thrilling voice of the mummy fell upon Lord Edmund's ear as a warning from the tomb. He too was relying on his own strength, and should he too fall? Forbid it, heaven! No, thought he, in some cases I might fear, but now, when the welfare of her I love is at stake, I cannot fail. The mummy smiled as he read the thoughts that passed over Lord Edmund's expressive countenance. Thus I too thought, muttered he, and as I was, so will he be deceived. Human nature is still the same even in this remote corner of the globe. Fool that I was, then, to attempt to reverse her decrees. Forgive me, mighty Isis. The rest was lost in inarticulate murmurs as the mummy's head sank upon his breast. Oh, God, cried Edmund to Father Maurice, whence comes this fearful spectre? What does it import? I know not, said Father Maurice, in a hoarse unnatural whisper, his eyes still strained upon the mummy. Edmund started, for the unusual abstraction of Father Maurice added fresh horror to the scene. His senses seemed bewildered, he scarcely knew where he was, or what was passing around him. He rubbed his eyes, and tried to wake from what appeared a frightful dream, but in vain. The vision was still there in all its horrible distinctness, and Edmund felt a terrific creeping steal along his nerves as the hollow sepulchral voice of the mummy again fell upon his ears. Alas! Where am I? Continued he. Can that river be a ramification of my beloved Nile? Or am I indeed torn from all I prize and love, to be cast upon this secluded spot, where all seems strange and insignificant? O deity of the foaming waters! Holy Sirius, hear me. Calm my troubled spirit, and grant some gracious manifestation of thy divinity to chase my growing doubts. But I deceive myself, this is not the Nile. No Papyrine boats glide o'er its polished surface. No acanthus groves nor forests of lofty palm border its banks. No, no. The immortal palm, fit emblem of the soul, grows only in those favored realms, where, spanning at oppression, it resists the feeble efforts of man to bend it to the earth, and springs upward with only added vigor from the feeble attempts made to subdue it. The mummy ceased, and a solemn silence prevailed, whilst passions fierce as the whirlwind's fury flitted across his face, chilling the beholder's heart with horror at the fearful being whose bosom could conceive them. Father Maurice was not naturally timid, he even possessed uncommon strength both of nerves and mind, yet an unwonted shuddering ran through his frame as he gazed upon Cheops, and traced the workings of that demoniac mind as they were successively imprinted on his features. Involuntarily he turned away in disgust. For God's sake, let us go, cried he, gasping for breath, for a strange feeling that he could not define, seemed to impede his respiration. Yes, yes, let us go, stammered forth Edmund, still, however, keeping his eyes fixed upon the awful object of his fear, as he slowly moved towards the door. Stay, cried Cheops in a voice of thunder. Involuntarily they obeyed. How feeble is this race of men, resumed the mummy, how different from the sons of ancient Mizraim, from the Macrobian Ethiopians, or even our Palic foes, degenerate in form as well as spirit. Their souls no longer seem emanations from the divinity, though perhaps the immortal spark becomes degraded and abased from its long continuance in clay, and is sunk forever from its pristine greatness. Stay, then, continued he, why should you fly me? I mean you no harm, and I swear by the sacred tomb of Osiris in Philly, that I will not hurt you. Drive me not then from amongst you, and I may aid your projects. At least, it is your duty to receive me as the destined instrument of fate, since Osiris decrees that my soul shall quit its transmigrations in the form of animals to reanimate this worthless body. Take me then into your counsels, confide in my power, and I swear by the holy dust of Isis that you shall not repent. Avaunt, demon, cried Lord Edmund, and, bursting from the room, he rushed out of the house. What farther passed between the priest and his awful visitor was known only to themselves, for when the family descended to breakfast, the mummy was gone, and Father Morris appeared absorbed in his usual studies, without taking the slightest notice of the terrific occurrences of the night. The death of the Queen being now generally known, her remains, laid in state, were exposed to the lamentations of her subjects, and the family of Mrs. Montague were amongst the earliest visitors to the mournful spectacle. In an immense hall, hung with black, was placed a kind of bier, covered with black cloth, supporting the body of the deceased Queen, over which was thrown a velvet pall, so disposed, however, as to display the beautiful features of the deceased, which, though now fixed in death, still retained their native expression of majestic dignity. Immense tapers of an enormous thickness lighted the sombre walls, hung with black cloth, whilst chorister boys walked up and down chanting hymns in honor of the deceased, and flinging incense in the air from silver vessels suspended by silver chains, which they carried in their hands, thus shedding fragrance around, and chasing the fearful odor of mortality even from the very chamber of death. Priests wrapped in funeral garments also slowly paraded the room, muttering prayers, and joining occasionally their full, deep-toned voices with the shriller chant of the boys. The space where the public were admitted was railed off from the lower end of the hall, but near the body knelt a beautiful female arrayed in black velvet, and her fair face and arms shaded by a veil of black crepe dot. "O Osiris," cried a figure wrapped in a long dark cloak, grasping the arm of Father Morris, "who is that lovely creature? There, bending over the last awful relics of mortality, methinks she looks beauteous as the phoenix rising from the funeral pile, and triumphing in glory over the impotent malice of the grave." "Hush! Hush! For heaven's sake," whispered the deep, full voice of Father Morris, "it is Elvira, the rival of Rosabella, whom you have sworn to support." "Typhon himself could not injure her," said Cheops, for it was he, and he stood with his eyes fixed upon her, apparently lost in meditation. "For mercy's sake, let us go on," whispered the priest. "You will excite attention, we shall be discovered. Besides," continued he in a lower tone, "did you find a crown so delightful that you think you would injure her by depriving her of one?" "No. By the holy limbs of Osiris," said Cheops, and, obeying the influence of the friar's arm, he moved onwards. "Why was not Rosabella with Elvira in the hall?" asked Sir Ambrose. "I thought it was commanded by the law that all the princesses of the blood royal should exhibit themselves publicly as mourners by the corpse of the deceased queen." "Rosabella is ill," replied the Duke. "Grief for the loss of her cousin has produced an access of fever, and she is unable to quit her bed." "Indeed," returned Sir Ambrose, incredulously, "it is very strange. I own I did not give Rosabella credit for so much sensibility." Notwithstanding the incredulity of Sir Ambrose, however, Rosabella was really dangerously ill, though her illness did not proceed exactly from the cause she chose to assign for it. The terror she had felt at the sudden appearance of the mummy, whom she thought a supernatural being, at the very moment she believed the death of her cousin was darkly hinted at by the monk, operating upon an overexcited imagination, had produced fever, and for some days Rosabella was in considerable danger. The secret exertions of Father Morris, however, in her behalf, prevented Rosabella's cause from being injured by her illness, and, by the time she was able to leave her bed, Lord Gustavus de Montfort, Lord Maysworth, and Dr. Hardman, with the Lords Noodle and Doodle, had declared themselves her adherents, bringing with them all the numerous host who, finding it too much trouble to judge for themselves, are always ready to follow in the train of a great man. The day when this important declaration was made, was that on which all the nobility of the realm assembled in that splendid monument of antiquity, Westminster Hall, to choose the Council of State to govern the kingdom during the interregnum. This venerable pile, which had seen so many generations successively rise and pass away, now cleared of the encumbrances with which the bad taste of the Middle Ages had loaded it, shone in all its original magnificence, and opened wide its ponderous portals to receive the whole nobility of England upon this important occasion. It was a glorious, and almost an awful sight, to see so many great and illustrious characters, some of whose names were celebrated even to the remotest corners of the globe, collected together in that magnificent hall. Few, however, thought of the grandeur of the spectacle, the deep interest excited by the occasion that assembled them absorbing all minor feelings. The business of the day was soon entered upon, and 12 noble individuals chosen to direct the affairs of state, till another queen should be elected. The Duke of Cornwall, Lord Edmund Montague, Lord Gustavus de Montfort, Lord Maysworth, and the Lords Noodle and Doodle, were amongst the number chosen, and as soon as the election was completed, the council retired together to an apartment appropriated to their use, to consult upon the measures to be taken to secure the due election of their future queen. Then it was that the anxious father of Elvira was paralyzed, to hear the noble lords above mentioned declare themselves partisans of her rival, and to see others who had till then remained neuter, seem inclined to range themselves upon the same side. In vain did Edmund exert his powerful eloquence. The weight and influence of the adverse lords far outweighed all his arguments in the breasts of the auditors, and the poor old duke returned home depressed and almost broken-hearted, from the conviction he received, that the feeling of the majority of the council was decidedly against his child. The moment the duke reached his own palace, he repaired to the apartment of Rosabella, and found her apparently in a state of convalescence, reclining upon a sofa, supported by her confidant Marianne, with Father Maurice sitting at her feet. The Holy Father was evidently confused at the unexpected arrival of the Duke, and he rose hastily in great disorder, to endeavour to account for his appearance there. The Duke, however, was too much enraged to listen to him, or, indeed, to notice the suspicious circumstance of his secretly visiting the princess. His passion was solely directed against Rosabella, and not even her present feeble and emaciated appearance was sufficient to disarm his anger. "Wretch," he exclaimed, "vile, ungrateful wretch that thou art! Thou hast destroyed me. Thou wilt bring the grey hairs of thy benefactor with sorrow to the grave. And so treacherously too. Oh, Rosabella! How could you plot against me whilst you were enjoying the shelter of my roof? Against me, did I say? Alas! Would it were only against me! But no! With fiend-like barbarity, you have conspired to destroy my child." The Duke had here unwittingly struck a chord that thrilled through the inmost souls of his auditors. He did not heed their confusion, however, but went on. "Oh, Rosabella! If I could have guessed, when thou wert brought to me a little smiling infant, and I took thee under my protection to foster thee as my own child, that thou wouldst prove a serpent to sting my heart to the core. But I was told it would be so. Sir Ambrose warned me to beware. Your brother, said he, has proved a villain, the violence of his passions has led him to commit unheard of crimes, and may not the same furies glow in the bosom of this smiling infant? Do not desert her, but do not educate the offspring of guilt in the bosom of your own family." "And did Sir Ambrose say this?" exclaimed Father Maurice, grinding his teeth together, and scarcely able to articulate from the strength of the emotion that convulsed his frame. The Duke, however, did not hear his question, and passionately continued, "He advised well, but I was deaf to his counsel. Fate hurried me on to my own destruction, and I nourished with the tenderest care a wretch whom I have this day discovered plotting with traitors to deprive my child of her birthright." "What do you mean, my lord?" said Rosabella. "I do not understand you." Yes, replied the Duke, "ask what I mean. You may well assume that face of smiling innocence, too often it has served your purpose. Fool, idiot, that I have been, to have been so easily deceived. But your arts will now be vain. Lord Gustavus de Montfort would not have openly declared himself your friend, as he did today, if the most insidious arts had not been practiced to win him. And has he done so? Asked Rosabella, her eyes sparkling with joy. Has he done so? Repeated the Duke bitterly. No doubt you know it but too well. Also that the prosing Lord Maysworth, the enlightened Lord Noodle, and the intelligent Lord Doodle, have enlisted their empty heads and long purses upon your side. Have they? Cried Rosabella, transport brightening every feature. Oh, Rosabella, exclaimed the Duke, passion giving way to agony, and torrents of tears streaming down his aged face, that look of affected astonishment is intolerable. You must have known all this. I am a poor, weak, old man. There needed not such plotting to deceive me. It breaks my heart to find you guilty of hypocrisy. Rosabella was affected by her uncle's tears. All his former kindness rushed upon her mind, and nature assuming her powerful influence, she forgot all her ambitious projects, her hopes, her fears, and her intrigues. She thought only of the feeble, miserable, old man before her, and, attempting to throw her arms round his neck, she sought to mingle her tears with his, and, clinging to his feet, implored his forgiveness. The Duke, however, could not read her heart, and, blinded by his passion, saw in this action only an aggravated insult. Violently he spurned her from him, commanding her to leave his house immediately, and, by so doing, extinguished forever every gentler feeling in his niece's breast. Rosabella's haughty spirit did not wait a second repulse. Her tears were instantly dried, and, with eyes flashing fire and cheeks glowing with indignation, she rushed out of the room, without deigning to reply. The Duke's rage, if possible, exceeded her own, and these near relations, united as they were by the tenderest ties, parted in mutual hatred, sincerely hoping, on both sides, that they might never meet again. Father Maurice and Marianne followed Rosabella, and they found, as they expected, that the violent overexcitement of the moment had given way to hysterics. These tremendous convulsive agonies soon exhausted her enfeebled frame, and she lay upon a sofa in a state of torpid languor nearly approaching to insensibility, whilst her friends consulted upon what course they should pursue. During this pause of uncertainty and painful deliberation, for as Rosabella was entirely dependent upon her uncle, the case seemed hopeless, a letter arrived from Lord Gustavus de Montfort offering the loan of his palace and his purse to the princess. That prudent and calculating nobleman was fully aware of the situation in which Rosabella would be thrown by his declaration in her favour, and of the advantage that would accrue to himself in after times, if she should obtain the crown, from his having at such a moment conferred an important service upon his future sovereign. Father Maurice did not hesitate to open this letter and read it. Rosabella was not in a state to be consulted. Indeed, the case was one that did not admit of hesitation, and a conveyance having been procured, the princess was removed to the house of Lord Gustavus, before she had recovered the full use of her faculties. Chapter 15. The morning appointed for the election of the Council of State was passed by Elvira in the most intense anxiety. For herself, she had no wish to be a queen, nay, perhaps she trembled at the thought, but when she saw how earnestly it was desired by her father, and thought of the bitterness of his disappointment should she be rejected, her eyes filled with tears, and she felt ready to make any sacrifice to promote his happiness. Thus, trembling with agitation, yet fearing alike every change, the fair Elvira sate, leaning her head upon her hand, whilst Sir Ambrose, whose rank did not entitle him to a vote, Dr. Coleman, and Henry Seymour, endeavoured to console her. "My dear young lady," said the good doctor, indeed, I think you distress yourself quite unnecessarily. With such supporters as your father and Lord Edmund, I do not think you can fail of success." "You quite mistake me, doctor, I assure you," returned the princess. "I think not of the crown, yet it is not possible to express what I have suffered during the last few hours. Ere my father went to the council this morning, his agitation was so excessive that I feared it would destroy him, and my impatience for his return is become almost agony. Let me entreat your highness to be composed, said Henry Seymour. You torment yourself with vain terrors. I cannot suffer myself to imagine for a moment that the Duke can be otherwise than successful. My dear child, observed Sir Ambrose, exert your own good sense. Nothing can be more foolish than to let imaginary horrors usurp any influence over your senses. You thus suffer doubly, and often the pains of anticipation exceed those of reality. But, see, here comes Father Murphy, and my little lively niece, Clara. Well, father, what news? Will the princess be queen? Ark, and there can be no manner of doubt of it, returned Father Murphy. Elvira turned pale. God in his mercy grant you may be mistaken, said she. Oh, dear, cried Clara, involuntarily. Why do you exclaim, fair lady? Asked the doctor, smiling. I am so surprised, so astonished, said the blushing girl. At what? Resumed the doctor inquisitively. That, said Clara timidly, that the princess should not like to be a queen. Alas! Alas, said Elvira, smiling languidly, you are too young, Clara, to know the awful responsibility such a situation would impose. The Queen of England must devote herself to her people. Once elected, she is cut off forever from all the happiness of domestic life. She must form no ties, she must indulge in no attachments, she can never feel the happiness of devoting herself entirely to promote the welfare of one adored object. She can never know the transports of a mother, and, sighing deeply, Elvira cast her eyes upon the ground, whilst those of Henry Seymour were fixed earnestly upon her. Yet all this, said Sir Ambrose, is rather imaginary than real. The subjects of a good queen ought to be her children, and the glory of contributing to the happiness of thousands, and ruling nations by a nod, may well compensate for the humbler comforts of a domestic fireside. I do not agree with you, rejoined Dr. Coleman. I think the situation of a queen is one both of trouble and responsibility. We all know how difficult it is to give satisfaction even in the most ordinary occurrences of life, and how much more must that difficulty be increased in such an exalted station. Besides, it seems cruel to condemn a young and beautiful woman to the miseries of celibacy. Woman naturally seems to want support. She is to man what the clinging ivy is to the majestic oak, its loveliest ornament, but take away the standard tree, and she falls forlorn and unsupported to the dust. Do you not think so, Mr. Seymour? The youth started at this appeal, for his thoughts had indeed wandered far from the scene before him. Yes, said he, after a short pause. Sir Ambrose laughed heartily. Upon my word, said he, I congratulate you, Dr. Coleman, upon your happiness in having such attentive auditors. The princess looks as if she had not heard a single word that you have said, whilst Mr. Seymour, when you appeal to him for his opinion, only starts, and says yes. You are quite right, Sir Ambrose, returned Dr. Coleman, smiling good-humouredly, and I begin to discover that reasons are quite useless when the feelings are interested. Ark, said Father Murphy, and my opinion is that we have all reason to be interested, for I should not be surprised at all, if the King of Ireland was to take advantage of our troubles, to make a descent upon us. There is no time so fitting for throwing everything into confusion, as when nobody knows what he is doing. There may be much justice in your remark, Holy Father, said Henry Seymour, smiling, but, for my own part, I own I do not apprehend the King of Ireland has any such bloody-minded intentions. Report speaks highly of his son, observed Elvira. Not more highly than he deserves, cried Dr. Coleman enthusiastically. The youthful Roderick is brave, noble, and generous, possessing every quality to fit him for a hero, and is quite incapable of anything bordering upon meanness. Is he handsome? Asked Clara, with infinite naivete, looking up earnestly at the doctor as she spoke. As the Achilles of the ancients, replied the doctor. Dear me, how I should like to see him, said the little beauty, with the utmost simplicity, should not you, Mr. Seymour? I cannot say I have any curiosity, returned Henry Seymour, having infinite difficulty to help laughing. "Dear me, how very odd," said Clara, looking at him earnestly. "I do believe the doctor was only quizzing us, and that is very ugly and disagreeable." "Is he, Mr. Seymour?" The air and manner with which she put this question quite destroyed the small remains of gravity Henry Seymour had till now with so much difficulty preserved, and, bursting into a violent fit of laughter, he rushed out of the room. Everybody looked astonished, and Dr. Coleman embarrassed. After a short pause, however, he seemed to recover himself. "It is very strange the Duke does not come," said he, pulling out his watch. "The council must be chosen before this, and they seldom stay to deliberate long at a first sitting." "I am miserable," cried Elvira. "If he should be ill." "Shall I seek him?" asked Dr. Coleman, and, reading her assent in her countenance, he quitted the room. "The doctor is very obliging," said Sir Ambrose, "but he never did like Rosabella. He hated her father, and when Duke Edgar, but, I forget. His history is a secret which must rest forever in my own breast." "Do tell me, uncle," cried Clara coaxingly. "I should so like to hear it, and everybody says you know all about him." "And what can his history have to do with such a little chit as you?" "I don't know," said Clara with the utmost innocence, "but I am sure I should like to hear it." "Why?" again asked Sir Ambrose. "Because everybody says it is a secret," replied Clara, clinging round him, and fondly stroking his face. "So do tell me, my dear uncle, pray do." "You are a little coaxing witch," said Sir Ambrose, patting her long silky hair. "I would tell you anything in reason, but the history of the father of Rosabella." "Rosabella!" cried the Duke, bursting into the apartment with the fury of a maniac. "Rosabella! Who speaks of Rosabella? She is a wretch, a vile, insidious wretch. She has destroyed me, she has conspired to destroy my child." And as he spake, the agonized old man sank into a chair, fainting with exhaustion, whilst a sanguine stream gushed from his mouth and nostrils, a blood vessel having been ruptured by the violence of his emotions. Elvira shrieked in anguish, and, dreadfully terrified, threw herself upon her knees beside him, imploring him to speak to her, whilst Sir Ambrose, even more alarmed than herself, ran screaming for assistance. Dr. Coleman and Henry Seymour were at hand. The Duke, and his daughter, who had fainted, were conveyed to their separate apartments, attended by Clara, Sir Ambrose, and the doctor, whilst Henry Seymour and Father Murphy were left together. "Oh beauty," thought Henry Seymour, as he watched the lovely form of Elvira, looking like some fair flower drooping on its stem, carried past him. "How omnipotent is thy power! Even the savage monarch of the forest, tamed by thee, has crouched beside a maiden's feet. How heavenly does she look! Pure as the immortal spirit, when, ere his breast was sullied by the grosser passions, man first conversed with God." "And sure if it's the Princess ye thinking of," said Father Murphy, tired of being so long silent, "ye've reason to look so sadly after her, for it's all over, and she'll never be queen." Henry Seymour started. The voice of the Holy Father sounded harsh and discordant in his ears. It had dispelled all his fairy dreams, and with a movement of impatience he threw open some folding doors, and walked into the garden. Father Murphy followed him. "And where is it that ye going?" asked he. "I would be alone," said Henry in a commanding tone. "And so ye shall be," returned Father Murphy, "when I'm after laving ye, and that I will do in a whiffy. But begone!" cried a peculiarly low, hollow voice which sounded close to the friar's ear. He started, and as he looked up, the withering glance of Cheops fell full upon him. He screamed wildly and fled, uttering shrieks of terror. Cheops looked after him with a scornful smile, and then fixing his superhuman eyes on Henry Seymour, he waited for him to speak. Few were the human beings who could have met that scowl unmoved. Those wild eyes, shaded as they were by the thick dark brows above them, always seemed to sink direct to the beholder's soul. Henry Seymour, however, shrank not from their gaze. A long pause ensued. "You wish for help," said Cheops, "and it is in my power to assist you. I know you well, you are not what you seem, but fear not, and all your hopes shall be fulfilled." "Alas! How can they," said the youth, "when I know them not myself?" "Hear me," returned Cheops, "you love Elvira, you would fain become her husband, and would yet not deprive her of the crown. Even now, you are revolving in your mind a scheme to reconcile these two apparently incompatible objects, but, besides innumerable minor obstacles, one great one destroys your plans. You have a father." "In the name of heaven," cried Henry Seymour wildly, "who and what art thou?" But, ere he had finished speaking, the mummy was gone. "Fiend! Demon!" cried the youth, "what means this unreal mockery? But thou shalt not escape me thus." In the meantime, the Duke had somewhat recovered, and, by permission of Dr. Coleman, Lord Edmund and Sir Ambrose were admitted to his chamber. The Reverend Fathers Morris and Murphy were there already. "I believe it is quite against the rules," said the doctor, "to allow visitors to a patient in the Duke's state, but he is so irritable, I fear keeping him in suspense might occasion a relapse." "I am sorry to see you thus, my dearest friend," said Edmund, pressing the Duke's hand warmly. "You have always been a second father to me, and, God knows, I love you as myself." The Duke fervently returned his pressure, but he could not speak. "My dear, dear friend," said Sir Ambrose, the tears trembling in his eyes. "Come, come," said Dr. Coleman, good-humouredly, "I must not let you agitate my patient. Lord Edmund is only come, my Lord Duke, to take leave. He is going into the country to try to exert his influence amongst the electors." The Duke shook his head. "I must not have you despair," said Sir Ambrose, "we shall beat them yet, not but that we must fight hard, for Rosabella is as crafty as a fox, and you see what a party she has made. Besides, she's as selfish as her father." "No," said the Duke feebly, and speaking with great difficulty, "Edgar was not selfish." "The influence of natural affection is astonishing," said Sir Ambrose, "since it makes you speak thus of one who has so grossly injured you." "Edgar's faults," replied the Duke, scarcely able to articulate, "were rather those of circumstance than of feeling. I am convinced of it, and forgive him. Nay, if he were alive, and I could see him, I would clasp him to my heart." "Ark," said Father Murphy, "and that's said just like yourself, for there's nothing so like a Christian spirit as forgiving our enemies, and so may heaven prosper and bless all that love ye, and send all that hate ye to the devil." "But how does that accord with the Christian spirit you were talking of?" asked Dr. Coleman, smiling. "Ark," replied Father Murphy, "and it's plain another thing. For none but the devil's own brats could hate the Duke, and he's a right to his own, surely." Dr. Coleman, though not quite convinced by the sophistry of the Holy Father, did not attempt to controvert it, and the party, fearing to fatigue the Duke, soon after separated. A few hours after this conversation, Father Morris was walking in one of the shadiest parts of the garden of Mr. Montague, where the thick trees spread over his head, and by their umbrageous foliage, almost shut out the light of the sun. In the very centre of this gloomy grove, a funereal urn had been erected by one of the former possessors of the mansion, over which hung a weeping willow. The monument had once been gaudily adorned with bright colours and gilding, to mark the armorial bearings and dignity of the dust that mouldered below. Now, however, damp and neglect had hastened the work of time in that secluded spot. The once white marble was stained with a dirty green, and moss had grown round the crumbling monument of former greatness. The plaster effigies of the arms had cracked, and peeled off in places, whilst wild flowers had taken root in the fissures, and reared their blooming heads, and twined their fantastic wreaths around the mouldering stone, hanging in wild luxuriant festoons over this emblem of decay, as though to mock the feeble efforts of man to perpetuate his name, and assert triumphantly the supremacy of nature. Father Morris was struck by the effect produced by this apparently simple circumstance, and he stood with his arms folded on his breast, attentively gazing upon the urn. And for this, thought he, yes, even for such perishable baubles as these, does man risk his immortal soul. For this, for honors that decay even whilst we gaze upon them, for fame, which the slightest breath may blow away, light as the thistle's down, for wealth and power, which, past a certain point, pall on the senses, and for ambition, we sacrifice all the mind holds dear to it. And what is ambition? What real happiness can fame, wealth, or power bestow? I will repent, it is not yet too late, for worlds I would not harm that poor old man. Yes, he has still a heart. I am not wholly lost. Oh! How his look, his voice thrilled to my inmost soul, and awakened feelings I thought forever dead. Oh, Julia! Julia! Surely thy blessed spirit would rejoice if angels can still feel for mortals, at my repentance. Oh, if one fatal act could but be recalled, and one fiend be satisfied, I might still be saved. And overpowered by his emotions, even his firm heart was softened, he leant his head against the mouldering urn, and, hiding his face in his cowl, he wept. Blessed were those bitter tears, and sweet were the sensations that stole over the mind of the monk as they flowed, for they were the first fruits of human feeling that had long touched that savage breast. Soothed by their healing balm, and half forgetting the cares that hung about him, Father Morris still reclined against the tomb, whilst mild and pleasing images floated before his fancy, and the fairy form of happiness rose again upon his sight, and, though dim and indistinct by distance, seemed once more to beckon him forward through the mist of time. Lost in these meditations, the most delightful he had long indulged in, the father remained unheedful of the lapse of time, till he was startled by a tap upon his shoulder, and, turning, he beheld the giant form of Cheops. "Fiend, demon, devil," cried he, passionately, "avaunt! And tempt me not." The mummy burst into one of his frightful laughs of derision. "What," said he, "have you forgot your friend? Your confidant? Your confederate? And is it thus you treat him? Have you forgot our compact and your oath? Which, if it were necessary, was to be sealed with blood?" The friar shuddered, whilst Cheops continued. "Pshaw! Pshaw! Talk not of temptation. The passions in that breast defy its power, for demons scarce could credit them. Fear not temptation then, most pure and most immaculate priest. For no, I can read thy heart, and yes, even I shudder at the wickedness it conceals. My feelings are changed, I repent." "Impossible. Your repentance is but as a passing shade before a glowing fire, which, even if not removed, would be soon devoured by the flames. I tell you, my purpose is changed. I will no longer plot against the Duke, and Elvira, if she will, may be queen." "And do you think a crown so enviable then," said the mummy, repeating the friar's own words, once addressed to him, "that you think you would injure her by depriving her of its cares?" "Devil," cried the father, unable to resist the feelings these words had conjured up. "And these are mortals," said Cheops, "they sin, and they repent. Thus adding hypocrisy to guilt, and doubling their crimes by the knowledge they have of their enormity." "Demon," returned Father Morris, "the words of that old man wrung my heart, and I would sacrifice all the world can give, to throw myself upon his breast, and obtain his forgiveness." "I believe you think so now," said Cheops maliciously, "but when Rosabella shall be queen, and wealth and dignities shall be dispensed by Father Morris, when nobles shall bend humbly before him, and, hanging upon his smile, beg favours from his hand, then—" "Curses on thee, fiend," cried Father Morris, rushing from the grove, and pressing his cowl round his head with both his hands, as though he feared the horrid laugh of Cheops should echo in his ears, and sting him into madness. "Weak, feeble worm," exclaimed Cheops, with a scornful laugh, looking after the friar as he darted from his sight, "and yet this man boasts of his intellect, and rules his fellow men almost to his will. Degenerate wretches! O powerful Osiris! If from thy dread abode thou deignest to look down upon thy votary, pity him now. Condemned to waste his days amongst this hated race. And thou, fell Typhon! Dread avenging deity! Say, will thy awful wrath accept of victims such as these? Alas! I fear vengeance like thine will not be thus appeased. And that thy never-dying fire will still gnaw my vitals. Oh! These mortals think they suffer, but what are their torments when compared to mine?" As he spoke, he gnashed his teeth in fury, whilst again the expression of passions, too tremendous to be conceived by mortals, darkened on his brow. Chapter 16. "I am really glad we have left the house of my uncle," said Rosabella to Marianne, the morning after her removal to the palace of Lord Gustavus, "for though there is something revolting to my feelings in being dependent upon a stranger, yet as it may soon be in my power to repay any obligations I may receive from him, it is better than the treachery I was obliged to practice towards the Duke. There is something so mean in treachery. We are always apt to feel most disgusted with those vices most repugnant to our nature," said Marian smiling, "whilst we are merciful to those we practice. However, I can't say I think there is much difference." "What?" cried Rosabella indignantly, "do you class those vices that spring from a noble though mistaken spirit, with those that are the natural offspring of base, grovelling minds?" "No," returned Marianne, "for I think the latter preferable, as the mind that produces them is incapable of making nobler efforts, whilst the others, by degrading their possessors, show forcibly the monstrous depravity of the human heart." "I do not understand you," said Rosabella. "Nor is it necessary you should," rejoined her confidant. Rosabella was not quite satisfied with this summary manner of dismissing the argument, and was proceeding to question her confidant's maxim, when a tap at the door announced a page from Lord Gustavus, who came to know if the princess would honor his master with an audience. "Certainly," said Rosabella, and in a few minutes Lord Gustavus entered her boudoir. "I hope your Serene Highness has rested well," said the noble lord with his usual pomposity. "I feel better this morning." "I am perfectly well, I thank your lordship," returned Rosabella, "and the relief I have experienced, by having the weight that has so long hung upon my mind relieved by my removal to your hospitable mansion, has proved an excellent soporific." "That being the case," said Lord Gustavus, "perhaps your Highness will have no objection to indulge the noble lords who already have declared themselves on your behalf, as also some others of their friends who are anxious to enlist under your banners, with an interview, for thinking as I think, and as I am convinced every reasonable person in the kingdom must think, no time ought to be lost in a matter of so much and of such infinite importance." Rosabella, thinking Par Merville exactly the same as the noble lord, instantly gave him her hand to lead her to his library, where the illustrious personages he had spoken of were waiting to receive her. It has been already said that Rosabella was beautiful, and now that her recent illness, and the agitation natural to the novelty of her present situation had softened the usual pride and haughtiness of her demeanor, she looked perfectly lovely. It has often been allowed that a beautiful woman never looks so well as when in affliction, there being something in the appearance of a timid helpless female, looking up to man for protection and support, that rouses every generous and manly bosom in her behalf, whilst that wretch must indeed be lost to every sense of feeling and humanity, who could be deaf to the prayer of beauty in distress. Thus the appearance of Rosabella caused a general sensation in her behalf, whilst her usual pride and haughtiness, which were well known, only made her present diffidence and agitation, her downcast eyes and trembling voice, appear still more interesting from the strong effect of contrast they produced. The persons collected in the library of Lord Gustavus were all affected by her manners, and though perhaps it would have been difficult to find a group of individuals more various in their usual habits and modes of thinking, yet upon this one point they were agreed. The personages who composed this worthy assemblage were Lord Maysworth, the Lords Noodle and Doodle, Dr. Hardman, and the young Prince Ferdinand of Germany, who had been taken prisoner by Lord Edmund, and was now upon his parole of honour, till the conditions for his ransom could be arranged. He was at present the guest of Lord Maysworth, who having in his youth received great obligations from the German Emperor, was now glad of an opportunity to show his gratitude to his son, and who had now brought him to Lord Gustavus, to introduce him to the Princess Rosabella. Prince Ferdinand was ardent and romantic, and he was just at that happy age when all appears bright and blooming, before reality has destroyed the flattering dreams of hope, when we are ready to believe all we wish, and imagine human nature without a blot. Alas! Why are the delightful moments of life so transient, and why can we never partake of pleasure without having our relish for it destroyed? Confiding, however, and unsuspicious as Prince Ferdinand was, he was certainly excessively astonished to hear Lord Maysworth, the advocate of freedom and equality, eloquently plead in Rosabella's behalf that her father was the elder brother of the present Duke, and that consequently her claim was strengthened by all the magic powers of primogeniture. And he was still more surprised by his assertion that the present Duke had rendered himself unpopular by advising the late Queen to rebuild the late palace at Richmond, by which several hundreds of workmen were kept in employ during the whole of the preceding winter, and saved from perishing. Good heavens, cried Prince Ferdinand, can you blame that? Was it not better than suffering them to perish with cold in the streets? No danger of that, Your Highness, no danger of that, returned Lord Maysworth. Nobody can perish of cold in our streets, because, you know, we have always pipes of hot air in them to make them quite warm. And as to the palace, it is really quite melancholy to think how many thousands of the public money were expended upon it. Oh! I assure you, it is quite impossible to find a man more deservedly unpopular than the Duke of Cornwall. Oh, quite impossible, said the Lords Noodle and Doodle, shaking their heads. Thinking as I think, however, and as I am confident everyone here must think, said Lord Gustavus, it will be imprudent to depend entirely upon the Duke's unpopularity. Lord Edmund is beloved by the army, and, as he is decidedly upon the side of Elvira, we cannot be too cautious. Oh, no, certainly, we cannot be too cautious, echoed the two repeaters. It is a glorious circumstance, however, said Dr. Hardman, that the choice of the Queen rests entirely with the people. Their voice alone will decide the glorious struggle, and their free unbiased opinions alone give the monarchy its future queen. Yes, said Lord Maysworth, it is true, it rests with them alone to decide the question, and for this reason do you not think it will be as well, my lords, for each of us to repair to his country seat, and endeavour, by his influence in the neighbourhood, to procure the election of such deputies as may be disposed to vote favourably to our wishes? The plan is excellent, cried Dr. Hardman. Excellent, exclaimed Lord Gustavus. Excellent, echoed his attendant satellites. Then it only remains for us to put it in execution, said Lord Maysworth. If the princess will excuse my absence, began Lord Gustavus. Oh, my lord, interrupted Rosabella hastily, for she dreaded his long speeches beyond the power of description, think not of me, I must be, indeed, unreasonable, if I could complain of your absence, when it is for my service you will be employed. The princess speaks like an oracle, said Dr. Hardman, and I think we cannot do better than put her wishes in execution. Farewell then, my friends, said Rosabella, her voice trembling with emotion as they parted, and may success attend you. For the present, my poverty, in all but gratitude, prevents my wishes, but the time may come, when you shall find the powerful Queen will not forget the favours conferred upon the dependent princess. Oh, cried the noble lords and Dr. Hardman, do not mention reward. Patriotism and the disinterested love of our country alone dictate our actions, we think of nothing else. "'Twould be treason, and worse than blasphemy," said Prince Ferdinand, "to mingle the thought of self-interest with such purposes. Who indeed can see the Princess Rosabella, and suffer the paltry thought of self to interfere with his devotion to her interests?" Rosabella smiled graciously upon the youthful speaker, though she did not speak. "If, however," said Lord Maysworth, "the interests of the state should require a general more experienced than Lord Edmund, I have served, and I would willingly forego the transports of domestic peace to devote myself to the welfare of my country." "Or, if the state should need a minister," observed Lord Gustavus, "thinking as I think, and as I am sure everyone else must think, she has a right to command the services even of one so devoted to retirement as myself." "For my part," said Dr. Hardman, "I wish neither place nor pension, but if my humble services in a medical capacity." "Fear not," returned Rosabella, "but that all your wishes shall be gratified, for, if I should be queen, I shall only regard myself as an agent to dispose my power to the hands of those most worthy of it." As she said this she withdrew, having the rare happiness to leave all her auditors perfectly satisfied with her conduct. In fact, such was their delight, that each stood for some moments after her departure lost in contemplation, indulging in daydreams of the delightful anticipations her words and manner had excited, till, like Farmer Ashfield and his dame in Speed the Plough, they were in imminent danger of running foul of each other in their abstraction. The entrance of a servant, however, roused them from their reveries, and, feeling somewhat alarmed of having so far forgotten the dignified sentiments they had been professing, they retired to their respective homes to take measures to put the scheme that had been suggested into execution. "How I hate that Lord Gustavus!" exclaimed Rosabella when she reached her boudoir. "Even if he makes a sensible observation, he adds so many explanations to it, that the spirit evaporates." "Yes," returned Marianne, "he has yet to learn, that to tack explanations to wit, is like adding water to wine, you diminish its strength and spoil its flavor, but even he is preferable to Lord Maysworth." "Oh, I don't think so," cried Rosabella, "for a ridiculous fool is always better than a prosing one. I can laugh at Lord Maysworth, but Lord Gustavus sends me to sleep." "When an important enterprise is undertaken," said Marianne, "it will not do to be very scrupulous about the tools one employs to accomplish it. It is the part of a man of talent to discover the weaknesses of the human beings around him, and make them each subservient to his purpose." "At any rate, that is not difficult in my case," rejoined Rosabella, "for my good friends are so eager to show themselves off, that, I must do them the justice to say, they neither give me the trouble to find out their weaknesses, nor the way to win them. Prince Ferdinand is the only one who possesses a single spark of noble feeling. And he, I think you say, seemed struck with your appearance." "He appeared to be so." "We must improve that prepossession. The alliance of Germany may be invaluable to us. You must encourage the hopes of the prince, and do all you can to fan his infant passion into a flame." "But I love Edmund." "Pshaw! How can you be so childish? I do not wish you to love Prince Ferdinand. If you can contrive to make him love you, it will be all that is necessary." "But do you consider the cruelty of trifling with his feelings?" Marianne laughed. "I did not imagine you so romantic," said she tauntingly. "Do not alarm yourself, the rage for dying of love is gone by, therefore, notwithstanding the power of your charms, you must excuse me, if I presume to doubt their murderous properties." Rosabella was too much mortified by the manner in which her confidant treated her scruples, to wish to continue the conversation, though the reasoning of Marianne produced its full effect upon her mind, and even, in spite of herself, influenced her conduct. In the meantime, the family of Mr. Montague experienced considerable uneasiness on account of Clara, whose health gradually declined. "I cannot imagine what is the matter with my daughter," said Mrs. Montague one day to Dr. Coleman. "I wish you would talk to her a little. Here, Clara, my dear, Do just step this way. You will be quite shocked, doctor, at the change in her appearance. Poor girl. I don't think she has ever properly overcome the fright she experienced at the first sight of the mummy, for she has never seemed herself since. Indeed. It seems to me she hoards some secret care that breaks her rest and drives her to despair. What do you quote that from, my dear? Asked Mr. Montague, more interested in his wife's quotation than the illness of his daughter. Oh. It is one of a lot I bought the other day at the Patent Steambook Manufactory, in Hatton Garden. I had been buying some other things, and so I persuaded the man to throw me in a bargain of quotations very cheap. They were all quite new, and ready cut, dried, and made up into pills for use. But I never saw such a man in my life. You think nothing at all about your daughter. I really wish you would question her a little, for she will tell me nothing. Very well, my dear, I will, said Mr. Montague, but the next instant he was absorbed in his studies again, and had even quite forgotten that such a being as Clara existed. Really, said Mrs. Montague to the doctor, I do not think any poor woman in the world ever was so plagued as I am. You see what a husband I have. He never troubles his head about anything, and if I were to take it into my head to walk off, I don't think he would even miss me. And then, my daughter, but here she comes. Clara, I sent for you to speak to Dr. Coleman. Dr. Coleman was excessively struck by the alteration in Clara's appearance. The beautiful, lively, blooming girl was changed to a pale shadow-like being, whose existence seemed to hang upon a thread, and whose fragile form the first and gentle breeze would annihilate. What is the matter with you, my dear child? Asked the doctor. Nothing, said Clara, sighing. And I don't know anything that can be worse, said Father Murphy, who happened to be present, for that's the speech a young lady always makes when she's in love, and I don't know any disease that's harder to cure. In love, cried Mr. Montague, roused from his lethargy by that ill-omened word, which generally grates so harshly upon the ears of parents and guardians. In love, repeated he, looking earnestly at his daughter, who can she possibly be in love with? That's the question, said his wife, for I'm sure I never trust her from under my own eye, and I'll defy her to fall in love without my knowing it. No, she cannot be in love. Ark! And that's no reason at all, cried Father Murphy, for I never knew of watching doing any good at all in such matters. Well, Clara, said Dr. Coleman, you hear Father Murphy's opinion. Do you plead guilty to the charge? Clara's blushes became deeper, and her agitation so excessive, as Dr. Coleman fixed his eyes upon her, that, finding she could not bear his looks, she burst into tears, and hurried out of the room. Poor Clara! The fangs of the most cruel of passions had indeed pierced thy heart, though thou wast unconscious of it thyself. It may be remembered, that, on the day of Edmund's triumph, Clara had been forcibly struck by the fine figure and noble appearance of a youth, who had walked as prisoner in the procession. It was Prince Ferdinand, who, having formed a strong intimacy with Lord Edmund, had been an almost constant visitor at the house of Mrs. Montague ever since. Clara was just at the age when the human mind first begins to feel the want of something to love. In her own family, her affections had been thrown back upon herself, and, being driven to the regions of fancy to find an object to occupy her heart, she would often wander for hours together in the garden, picturing to herself adventures, which she would paint in all the vivid colors of imagination, till, lost in creations of her own, she would almost forget the tame, cold realities of life. Of course, all these imaginary adventures could not exist without a hero, but Clara could never fix upon any definite form to bestow upon him, till she had seen Prince Ferdinand. Then, all her dreams seemed realized, and the secret god of her idolatry appeared to stand before her, in propria persona. Clara was now perfectly happy, and as, from the prince's frequent visits to her cousin, She now often passed whole days in his society, though he perhaps scarcely saw her, or at most regarded her but as a pretty child, yet she was satisfied. She saw him, and she heard him speak. What more was wanting to complete her dream of bliss? Lord Edmund's departure for the country, however, broke this magic charm. Prince Ferdinand came no more to Mrs. Montague's, and Clara heard of him only as the devoted admirer of Rosabella. Jealousy till that moment had been scarcely known to her, even by name, but it now shot its fiercest pangs into her heart. She had never been accustomed to conceal her feelings, and they now destroyed her. The climax, however, was still to come. One day, as she was mournfully pacing the terrace in her father's garden, she was startled by the appearance of Prince Ferdinand himself. Her agitation was excessive, her lips trembled, and she panted for breath, but he passed on without noticing her. Yes, it was he, the cherished idol of her thoughts, the hero of her dreams, and he had passed without seeing, or at least without seeming to behold her. Was it possible he could have seen her and passed so coldly? Was it possible she could be so totally indifferent to one who was all the world to her? Oh! There was madness in the thought. She could not bear her own reflections. What would become of her? She knew not, she cared not, and, in an agony of despair, she plunged into the thickest grove of the garden. Though it was summer, the day was cold and chilly, a drizzling mist fell fast, and a thick fog from the river wrapped the grove in gloom. Heedless however of the weather, Clara hastened on to the spot where stood the marble urn, but as she approached it, she started back, for close beside it stood the hideous figure of Cheops, dimly seen through the gathering gloom. "Fear not," said he in a softened, though still hollow voice, "tell me your woes, and, if I can, I will assist you." "Alas! It is in vain," cried Clara in an agony of despair too profound even to admit of her feeling the fear generally experienced by all who saw the mummy. "No one can relieve me, I have no hope." Cheops smiled. "Poor child," said he, "it is always thus when Eros first creeps into the soul, covering his arrows with roses, so that they are not seen till their barbed points rankle in the heart. I cannot tell how much I pity thee. So young and lovely too. It is hard that even thou shouldst not be exempt from the common lot of mortals. Yet do not despair." "I do despair," cried Clara, darting away from him. "I am truly wretched." From this moment Clara saw the mummy almost daily, and her mind acquired new force and energy from his society, though her health visibly declined. It was not, indeed, possible for human beings to hold daily intercourse with Cheops without feeling their souls withered. The glowing tints of youth and health faded rapidly from the cheeks of Clara. She became pale and spiritless, whilst she appeared to have lost all interest in the common affairs of life. Her fits of abstraction, however, her dejection, and her solitary wanderings, at length became so evident as to excite the attention of her mother, and the scene we have just described was the result. Nothing could be more painful to poor Clara than the questioning she had undergone. She rushed from the presence of her parents to her favorite garden, to think over what had passed, and implore the assistance of the mysterious being with whom she had associated herself. He was not there, however, and though she repeatedly called upon his name, he came not. The weather was now delicious, the autumnal tints, that had just begun to change the lovely verdure of summer into a glowing brown, gave richness to the landscape. Since the abolition of coal and wood fires, the air of London had become pure and bright, though it still remained soft from its vicinity to the river, and it was thus highly favourable to vegetation, whilst, as no house was permitted to approach within a certain distance of the Thames, the sumptuous gardens that bordered its banks were beautiful in the extreme. That of Mr. Montague, which has been so often alluded to, was in particular laid out in the greatest taste, and its grateful shade and delicious fragrance calmed poor Clara's troubled spirits, and soothed them to repose. Nothing, indeed, could have a more lulling effect upon the harassed senses than the scene before her. The air was perfectly still, not a leaf was agitated, not a flower stirred, all nature seemed to repose, but Clara alone felt restless. The questions of Dr. Coleman, and surmises of Father Murphy, had created a variety of new feelings in her mind, and she wandered up and down, oppressed by a sensation of melancholy which she had never felt before. She could not define her own sensations, she could not analyze her thoughts, and, as she sauntered to and fro without any determinate object, she listlessly pulled the leaves from a rose that she carried in her hands. The scattering of the rose leaves, however, recalled her to herself, and she smiled as she saw the mischief she had done. "Alas! Poor rose," sighed she, apostrophizing the flower, "I know not why I have destroyed thee." Then walking hastily away, she plunged into the thickest part of the grove. "Why am I thus agitated?" said she to herself. "Why do I feel thus miserable and discontented? Can it be love? Love," she repeated, whilst deep blushes glowed upon her cheeks, and she started at the echo of her own voice. She threw herself upon a turfy bank under a shady tree, and, resting her head upon her hand, watched through the leaves the light fleecy clouds that drifted along the sky, till, oppressed by the painful nature of her own sensations, she sighed heavily, and tears swam in her eyes. At this moment, footsteps rapidly approached, and Clara, springing upon her feet, hastily drew her hand across her eyes, and hid herself amongst the trees. Dr. Hardman and Father Morris, who approached, seemed absorbed in conversation, and Clara, who dreaded Father Morris excessively, kept herself concealed, to avoid meeting him. We have already mentioned that she was simple and innocent to a degree, but hers was the simplicity of ignorance, not folly. Her natural abilities were excellent, and her mind uncommonly strong. She therefore neither screamed nor fainted, though, from her present position, she became auditor to a scene of the deepest villainy. Notwithstanding the influence which Rosabella's party had at present in state, Father Morris was not satisfied. He wished to make her election certain, and this could be only done by removing Elvira. Dr. Hardman was her physician, the rest may be easily imagined. Clara trembled, and her flesh seemed to creep upon her bones, as she listened to this horrid conference. But her terror was even increased when they changed the subject, and spoke no longer of an intended murder, but of one which had been already committed. Clara shook in every limb, and her lips and cheeks became blanched with fear, yet she uttered no cry, nor betrayed her presence by the slightest motion. At length they went, and Clara stood like one awakened from a fearful dream, almost doubting the reality of what she had heard. An hour elapsed, yet Clara still stood motionless. What should she do? Would her unassisted testimony be believed in matters of such awful import against the weight and influence of two persons of so much consequence in the state? No, she felt it would not. Yet, if she remained silent, she would be accessory to the murder of Elvira. What could she do? What course ought she to pursue? She knew not. A chaos of thoughts seemed whirling through her brain, and threatened almost to drive her to madness. The longer she thought, the more she became confused, and she began to fear her senses were actually leaving her, when a solemn voice sounded in her ear. Well did she know those deep and awful tones, they were those of Cheops, and, confiding the awful secret to him, she promised to comply implicitly with his injunctions. It was the day following this adventure, that, as Father Murphy and Abelard were conversing tranquilly together, lamenting over the degeneracy of the age, their conference was interrupted by the sudden appearance of the Duke. "Where is Sir Ambrose?" cried he in a state of violent agitation. "Where is Sir Ambrose? I must see Sir Ambrose immediately." "Calm yourself, for heaven's sake," said Father Morris, who had followed him unobserved. "This violent agitation will destroy you. Remember your recent illness, your age, your weakness." "Where is Sir Ambrose?" cried the Duke. "This vehemence is unbefitting of your station," continued Father Morris. "Moderate it, I entreat you, it can do no good." "Will no one call Sir Ambrose?" reiterated the Duke, and as the baronet, who had been summoned by Abelard, appeared, he threw himself into his arms, sobbing like a child. "Oh, my dear, dear friend," exclaimed he, "they are determined to ruin Elvira. Lord Gustavus and his adherents are gone to their country seats to try to influence the election of the deputies, and my child can have no chance against such treachery." "If that be all," said Henry Seymour, who had accompanied the baronet, "why not follow their example? Your influence must, at least, be equal to theirs." "He is right," rejoined Sir Ambrose. "I know not why we did not do so sooner, but, even now, it is not too late." "And what end can possibly be produced by such a measure?" asked Father Morris, scowling darkly at the youth. "The freedom of the election should be inviolable." "But," hastily interrupted the Duke, "if they attempt to control it, we may surely." "I was not before aware," said Father Morris, in his cold, ironical manner, "that the circumstance of others doing evil was any reason for our committing sin." "Nonsense," cried the Duke, "there can be no sin in securing the election of my daughter, and so, Sir Ambrose, we will set off tonight, if you please." "With all my heart," said Sir Ambrose, and the two old men and Henry Seymour hurried away, leaving the monk alone. He did not, however, long remain so, for in a few seconds Cheops was at his side. "So, sir," said Father Morris, scowling upon Cheops with a look of deadly hatred, "you have proved yourself my friend, in suffering this babbling boy to counteract my views. Did you not boast he was your slave?" The mummy met his glance without shrinking, and, bursting into one of his fearful laughs, exclaimed tauntingly, "And so he is, but I thought you had determined not to oppose the Duke any longer. It seems, then, I did not understand your reasoning in the garden." "Fiend! Cursed mocking fiend!" cried the friar, gnashing his teeth. "Nay," returned Cheops, "why blame me? Was I wrong in believing what you said? Was it, then, only a part you were acting to deceive me? Demon! Thou canst read my heart, but it is thy wish to drive me to distraction." "No, no, my good Father Morris, my worthy friend, I honor you too much. If I can read your heart, I must be charmed to see such devotion to your friends, such candor, openness, and integrity. Taunting devil! Be my sins what they may, thy presence is a penance that might redeem them. By heaven! Hell itself were easier to endure than those bitter scoffs." "And darest thou talk of heaven," said the mummy in an awful voice, that thrilled through the father's soul, whilst his eyes glared with such supernatural luster that the priest could not bear their beams, and sank upon one knee before him, bending his head to the ground. "'Tis as it should be," continued Cheops, with one of his fiendish laughs. "Yes, he is mine, he bends before my will. Now will I tell thee what thy feeble reason was too powerless to discover. I am still thy friend. The Duke and Sir Ambrose will only injure their cause by the ill-judged measures they will take to promote it. The Duke and Sir Ambrose voluntarily throw away their strongest hold, they rush blindfold to destruction. They degrade themselves to your level, whilst, as they are unused to deceit, they will not succeed in their endeavors, and disgrace will be their only reward. Now, do you blame me? The Duke and Sir Ambrose voluntarily throw away their strongest hold, they rush blindfold to destruction. They degrade themselves to your level, whilst, as they are unused to deceit, they will not succeed in their endeavors, and disgrace will be their only reward. Now, do you blame me? Blame you, exclaimed Father Morris, you are my friend, my best, my only friend, my preserver. With regard to Edmund, said Cheops, we must excite his jealousy. If he were detached from Elvira, her cause would perish. It would, cried Father Morris. Try then thy efforts, said Cheops, and if thou canst excite suspicions, fan them gently to a flame, yet without seeming to do so. Do not attack Elvira openly, or assert broadly that she loves another, but hint it darkly, so that your victim cannot misunderstand, and that the damning certainty may flash upon his mind with greater force than mere words can give. Well knowest thou what I mean, and well hath nature modelled thee for such a part. That downcast look, that insinuating voice, and half-ironical manner, the infernal deity himself could not well have wished a more fitting agent to execute his designs on earth than thou. Work then upon Edmund, and success cannot fail to follow your attempts. Thou McEvil, cried Father Maurice, my friend, my dearest friend, my benefactor, oh! How I could fall down and worship thee. A sardonic smile curled the haughty lips of Cheops. Learn then to obey in silence, said he, nor dare again to blame designs far beyond your comprehension. Chapter 17. The day following was appointed for the departure of the two families of the Duke and Sir Ambrose for the country, and the whole preceding evening was passed by the two old men in arranging their plans, and forming new schemes to ensure success. Elvira took no part in this conversation, though certainly the person most interested. She was thoughtful and distrait. She was too restless to remain in one place. She walked to the window, she returned, and she again sat down. She attempted to work, to read, to draw, all was in vain, all seemed tasteless and insipid. Again she went to the window, and, opening its folding doors, stepped out upon the balcony. It was a delightful night, and the air felt soft and warm. Vines, laden with their luscious fruit, twined from pillar to pillar of the balcony, forming a kind of verdant network, whilst the moon shone bright upon the lovely scene beyond. Below, a smooth green lawn stretched forth like a velvet carpet, bounded on each side by Chinese rose trees, the delicate tints of which looked still more transparently beautiful in the lovely light. Behind these, rose trees of a loftier height and deeper shade, whilst at the extremity of the lawn wound the river. The clear moonbeams trembled on the gently rippling stream, and gave a transparent brightness to the graceful foliage of a weeping willow, which hung over the water, and quivered in every passing breeze. Elvira gazed upon the fair scene before her, and sighed heavily as she gazed. A gentle sigh softly echoed hers, and she started to find that Henry Seymour was standing before her. How beautiful is nature, said he, when undefiled by the follies and sins of man. Here one might forget the world, and all its busy turmoil of deceit. When one gazes thus upon the sublime and lovely face of nature, how poor do all the arts, the ambition, and the pitiful contrivances of man appear. The soul seems elevated to its proper sphere, and to long to throw off the frail covering of clay, which yet chains it down to the grovelling passions of earth, and to soar triumphant to its native skies. His fine eyes were turned to heaven as he spoke, and Elvira gazed upon them and his noble countenance beaming, with enthusiasm, till she quite forgot to reply. Do you not agree with me, Elvira, said he, in a tone of the softest melody, fixing his eyes upon hers with a look that sank deep into her heart. Again she sighed deeply, but she could not speak. Oh, Elvira, continued he, taking her hand, will you forget me? Will not the remembrance of this night form a tie between us, when we shall be far, far apart? Apart, cried Elvira, almost with a shriek of surprise. The youth sighed, and, gazing earnestly upon her blushing face, whispered tenderly, as he pressed her hand to his heart, oh that I could flatter myself sorrow mingled with that sigh. Why, what is this, said the old Duke, bustling to the window, the doctor tells me you are going to leave us. Shorty you might contrive to stay till after the election. I am very sorry, sir, said the youth, but the circumstance that calls me away. The doctor told me, a near relation dangerously ill, that can't die in peace till he's seen you. Well, my boy, such things must be, and if he's doomed to die, I only wish him an easy death, and you a good legacy. I cannot tell you how sorry I am to part with you, said Sir Ambrose, who now advanced, nor how sincerely I wish you good fortune. Thank you, sir, said the youth, alas! I now feel how poor words are to express my gratitude for all your kindness. But I am sorry to hasten you, Mr. Seymour, said Dr. Coleman, who now approached, but time was apace. True, said Henry, I had forgotten. Once more farewell. God bless you all, and he hurried away, as though fearful of his own resolution if he ventured to stay another second. For the rest of the evening, Elvira was silent and abstracted. The suddenness of the blow seemed to have stunned her, and she felt like one wandering in a dream. Was he really gone? Should she never see him more? Were questions she scarcely dared even to ask herself. He was nothing to me, a mere common acquaintance, she repeated incessantly, and yet she felt a wearisome void, a sickening disgust and impatience at everything around her, which she had never experienced before. What can be the matter with me, said she peevishly, I shall never see him again, and it is the excess of weakness to feel an interest in the fate of one, who is evidently so indifferent about me, and yet he seemed affected when he said we were about to part. Was he really so? But of what consequence to me is it whether he was so or not? I shall never see him more. And Elvira sighed involuntarily at the thought. I am devoted to other prospects. In short, I will think of him no more. And, in pursuance of this magnanimous resolution, she thought of nothing else all night. The following day, Elvira and her friends went into the country, but, as Cheops had predicted, the Duke and Sir Ambrose proved quite unequal to the task they had undertaken, and they only lost their popularity by the attempt. Men were disgusted to see personages hitherto considered so respectable descend to meanness, and the shallowness of the artifices by which it was intended to impose upon them excited their contempt. In the meantime, Lord Edmund was not more successful in London than his friends in the country. He had marched a chosen body of troops within a convenient distance of the metropolis, in consequence of which ill-judged measure, the members of the council, to show that they were not influenced by the fear of military authority, and to vindicate their independence, invariably opposed every measure that he suggested. As the law, however, forbade any decisive promises till the actual day of election, there was still hope, though the friends of Elvira struggled on, rather from a wish not too hastily to abandon her cause, than from any rational, well-founded prospect of success. In the midst of these anxieties, Elvira's health indeed seemed rapidly declining. A weight that nothing could alleviate hung upon her spirits. She made no effort to secure voters, but pale, silent, and melancholy, she glided about, the ghost of her former self. Still, however, she was lovely. The increased delicacy of her complexion, and shadowy lightness of her form, harmonized well with the general style of her beauty, whilst her fine eyes, shaded by their long silken lashes, only shone more brilliantly from the glowing hectic of the cheek below. The time fixed for the important ceremony now rapidly approached. The election of the deputies was concluded, and the families of the Duke and Sir Ambrose prepared to return to town. The night, however, before they departed, the Duke gave a grand fête champetre to the neighbouring gentry, and as a considerable number of the deputies were expected, he particularly enjoined Elvira to exert herself to the utmost to win their suffrages. Never perhaps had Elvira looked more beautiful than she did that night, as, pale, trembling and timid, she received her numerous guests, and never, perhaps, was effect more magical than that which her appearance produced. Her very diffidence and modesty attracted, and the reserve, with which she shunned, rather than sought the attention of the crowd, completed the enchantment. It is her fear of seeming to wish to interest us, whispered one deputy to another, that makes her treat us so coldly. Yes, replied the other, and I like her the better for it. If she were to attempt to make herself agreeable, I should hate her. The Duke and Sir Ambrose have sickened us of that. The fête was given in the gardens of the Duke, which were beautiful and extensive, and now brilliantly illuminated by lamps suspended from the trees. There was something, however, not quite congenial to Elvira's taste in thus marrying the gorgeous splendor of art to the simplicity of nature, and she sighed heavily as she watched the flaring lamps scorching the calm pale verdure of the trees. Now this is as it should be, said the old Duke, as he led his daughter to the pavilion appointed for her to receive her guests. Elvira now looks like herself. Does she not, Dr. Coleman? The doctor shook his head. I fear, began he. Oh! We will have no fears tonight, cried the Duke gaily, remember, Elvira. Everything now depends upon you. Play the part of the smiling, condescending hostess, win the hearts of the deputies, and you will make that of your old father leap for joy. We shall have a gay party, shan't we, Doctor, continued he, eyeing the groups as they advanced. I wish your friend, Henry Seymour, were here amongst us. Elvira started, and deep blushes suffused her cheeks at the mention of this name. The doctor eyed her attentively, though he replied as though he had not noticed her agitation. It was urgent business, you know, that obliged him to leave England. He was a charming youth, said the Duke, so gay and yet so fearless. I think, however, I observed that his spirit seemed much depressed the last time I saw him. You know, he said it was the death, I mean the illness of a relation, that compelled him to go. Young men don't generally feel so much for the illness, or even death of old ones, returned the Duke. Now, if I were to judge, Doctor, I should think it far more likely it was some love affair. But we can't stay talking about it now. I must go, and attend to my guests, and do you mind, Elvira, and make yourself agreeable. Poor Elvira, however, was, perhaps, never less fitted to obey her father's injunctions than at this moment, for the conversation she had just heard, had quite deranged her nerves. Her father's supposition inflicted a deep pang on her heart, and though she went through the duties of her station mechanically, her mind wandered to Henry Seymour. It was a lovely night, and the general effect of the scene, as groups of elegantly dressed people flitted to and fro through the lighted groves, was striking in the extreme. Beautiful flowering exotics decorated the pavilion of Elvira, and the balmy air that fanned their blossoms seemed loaded with sweets, whilst the richly illuminated castle, rearing its lofty towers in awful grandeur in the distance, had the appearance of a fairy palace. Elvira listlessly gazed upon the magic scene, till she felt almost fainting with the fatigue her situation as hostess imposed upon her, and she looked with a languid and almost despairing eye upon the crowds that came still pouring into the gardens. The throng, however, now opened, and a tall and dignified figure found its way through the mass. It was Lord Edmund. He approached rapidly, and threw himself at Elvira's feet. My adored Elvira, exclaimed he. You here, my lord, cried the princess, whose eyes, enfeebled by exhaustion, had not permitted her to recognize him till he was immediately before her. I did not expect to see you here tonight. Does my presence pain you then? Said Lord Edmund, looking at her attentively. They told me you were ill, and I do indeed find you changed. I am better now, returned Elvira faintly. Do not deceive yourself, cried he, with the most intense anxiety. You are ill, you are not equal to this fatigue. Retire from this scene, it will destroy you. I dare not, replied Elvira, still more feebly, without permission from my father, though, I own, I do feel exhausted. Lord Edmund waited for no more, but darted to find the Duke, and obtain his wished-for sanction. The next instant, his place was supplied by Prince Ferdinand, who had been invited into the country a few days before by the Duke, and who, with the inconstancy natural to his disposition, had now become as deeply smitten with Elvira, as he had before been with Rosabella. Elvira, however, saw him not, and, looking gratefully after Lord Edmund, sighed profoundly as she lost sight of him among the crowd. Happy Edmund, said the prince, what would I not give to create a feeling in that lovely bosom, like that caused by thy absence? Elvira blushed at the earnest gaze of the youthful German, as she replied, without exactly knowing what she said, do you suppose, then, that the absence of Lord Edmund gave me pain? What other cause can I divine for your melancholy, said Ferdinand. Adored by every heart, admired by every eye, and blessed at once with rank, beauty, and affection, what can Elvira wish, and what can cloud her brow with sorrow, or heave her lovely bosom with a sigh, unless it be the loss of the favoured lover whom ambition bids her sacrifice? And think you so poorly of me, returned Elvira indignantly, as to suppose, if I really loved Lord Edmund, that ambition would tempt me to sacrifice him? Can a heart like yours then be really dead to love? Said the prince, gazing upon her earnestly. Can nature have formed such exquisite beauty, and forgotten to give a soul to pity the wretches it must make? Elvira blushed deeply as he spoke, for his ardent look embarrassed her, and her eyes having been modestly withdrawn, again met those of Lord Edmund, who had returned without her perceiving him. 'Twas but for a moment, however, that she gazed upon him, for she shrank aghast from his withering glance. Jealousy and hatred curled his lips, and darkened upon his brow, whilst his features seemed so changed, that Elvira could scarcely believe he was indeed the same she had so lately spoken with. "I beg your Highness's pardon," said he haughtily, "I would not have presumed to intrude, if I had known you were engaged. I fancied that you wished to retire, and had obtained the Duke's permission for your doing so, but—" "Oh, thank you. Thank you, Edmund," cried Elvira, "most gladly will I seek my chamber." Then marking a slight smile upon Prince Ferdinand's face, she hesitated, for she recollected the interpretation he had put upon her melancholy and indifference. Lord Edmund's agony was beyond description. He saw her hesitation, he saw her look at Ferdinand, and fancying she sought his approval before she would retire, his jealous rage was unbounded, and, darting at her a look of ungovernable passion, he sprang from the pavilion, and was out of sight in an instant. Elvira could not bear his look, nor his unreasonable jealousy, and, exhausted by her previous fatigue, she fainted. A crowd soon gathered round her, and she was carried to her chamber in a state of insensibility. "Mark me," said a figure muffled in a thick cloak, speaking in a deep, low whisper, as he laid his hand upon the arm of Father Maurice, who stood gazing after Elvira, with a look of intense anxiety. "She must not die, for if she does, I swear by the holy tomb of Osiris at Philly, Rosabella never shall be queen." From that hour, Elvira recovered, and the consumptive symptoms, that had so strongly excited the alarm of her friends, entirely disappeared. Lord Edmund was conversing earnestly with one of the deputies, and, notwithstanding his jealousy, advocating the cause of Elvira with vehemence. When he was informed that she had fainted, his first impulse was to fly to her assistance, and when he found she had been removed to her chamber, his heart smote him for the cruel manner in which he had left her. She was really ill, thought he, and, in her feeble state, my harshness overpowered her. But never again shall my foolish jealousy disturb her peace. No! Let her scorn me, hate me, if she will. I will bear all the tortures she can inflict, rather than again hazard wounding that gentle bosom. Let her smile on whom she lists, even upon that hated German. I will not repine. If she be happy, I will ask no more. Thus thought Edmund, and he knew not that he deceived himself, till he saw Prince Ferdinand, who, with the happy elasticity of youth, was chatting gaily with one of the beauties of the court. Love him, thought he, as a scornful smile passed over his features. Love him, did I say? Oh, no. It is impossible. I could not endure to see her love that coxcomb, and, shuddering with the torments of jealousy, he turned away. Cheops was near him, muffled in a thick cloak that shrouded him from observation. The mummy marked the changes in Lord Edmund's countenance, and read well the feelings they betrayed. "Yes, even he," said he, with one of his fearful laughs, "will soon be mine, for never yet did man trust in his own strength, that did not fall." Chapter 18. The day of election now rapidly approached. The Duke, Sir Ambrose, the rival candidates, and the opposition lords, were all in London. The deputies were also assembled, and though it was forbidden to declare publicly for whom they intended to vote, till the decisive moment arrived, yet the popular feeling seemed so strongly in favour of Rosabella, that there appeared scarcely a chance for her rival. Exulting in her expected triumph, and confident of success, Rosabella sate in the splendid boudoir allotted to her use in Lord Gustavus's house, musing on her hoped-for grandeur. A large mirror was opposite to her, and as Rosabella saw her own fine figure reflected in it, joy sparkled in her eyes, and her mind wandered enraptured through scenes of future glory. Thus, completely absorbed in pleasing meditations, Rosabella was not aware that Cheops stood before her, till she heard his full, deep-toned voice repeating her name. "Rosabella," said he, "Rosabella, Queen of England. Hail!" "Cheops," exclaimed she. "Hail to the Queen of England," resumed he. "No longer need you stoop to solicit suffrages, your fate is sealed." "Think you that I am quite safe?" asked the princess, her eyes sparkling, and her cheeks glowing. "Certainly, there cannot be a doubt." "Then I may bid defiance to these wretches, and need no longer submit to their caprices, or be subservient to their humors." "Not unless you like it." "Like it," exclaimed Rosabella, her eyes flashing fire. "Can you suppose I like to practice meanness? Policy, indeed, recommends a contrary course," continued the mummy, "as, if you do not assert your own independence, they will encroach upon your condescension, and treat you as a slave." Rosabella bit her lips, and her bosom swelled with indignation. The mummy took no notice of her agitation, but went on. "Let them not bind you by any promises. Prove yourself a free and independent sovereign. Trample upon them, and they will crouch at your feet, but crouch to them, and they will trample upon you." "You say right," said Rosabella proudly, "and my would-be masters shall soon find their error. They think weakness has made me submit to their arrogance, but they shall see their folly." The influence the mummy exercised over the minds of all those he came in contact with was astonishing, and, in pursuance of his advice, Rosabella, from this moment, resumed her usual imperious manner, and received the compliments paid to her with the air rather of an empress long seated upon the throne, than that of an aspiring candidate for regal honors, dependent only upon the favor of the people. This excessive confidence, however, displeased the deputies. "She hardly leaves us a choice," said they, "for she seems to command us to choose her. Notwithstanding the strength of her party, and the weakness of her rival, we don't think she should take the thing quite in her own hands. The old queen ordered that the people should choose her successor, but this princess seems to have chosen herself. It is very kind of her to wish to save us the trouble, but, with her good leave, we think we might have managed to go through it without her help." These murmurs, however, though deep, were not loud, the party of Rosabella being too firmly established for anyone to dare openly to oppose it. The opposition lords had all returned to town, and, though they had not completely succeeded in the object of their journey to the country, they had at least satisfied themselves, and by the activity they had displayed, given themselves, as they imagined, a just title to the gratitude of their future queen. In the meantime, the friends of Elvira almost despaired. Few persons of note declared themselves her advocates, and though the favorable impression she had made upon the deputies still faintly operated, the feeling was fast fading away. An invincible repugnance to appear as the leader of a party oppressed her, and she shrank from the public gaze with a sensation little short of horror. Lord Edmund, however, still remained her firm and almost her only friend. Yet, though he exerted every nerve on her behalf, even he despaired of obtaining her election. Sometimes, indeed, as he gazed upon her beauty, a selfish feeling crept over his soul, and he could scarcely repress an emotion of joy, as he thought of the possibility that she might still be his, for the very qualities that impeded her success, only endeared her yet more fondly to his heart. The next instant, however, his nobler feelings would reproach this selfish joy, and with a kind of penitential sorrow, he would strive by fresh efforts to destroy the hopes, for the gratification of which his very soul panted. "I presume," said Lord Gustavus de Montfort to Rosabella, the day before that appointed for the election, "Your Highness does not intend to make Lord Maysworth a minister as well as a general, for, thinking as I think, and as I am confident everyone else must think, I feel assured he has no talents for the cabinet." "As Queen of England, my lord," returned Rosabella proudly, "I will not be dictated to, though I will do my best to choose such ministers as may, in my judgment, be most likely to promote the welfare of my country." Lord Gustavus was thunderstruck, and he gazed after her, as she retired, with mingled feelings of astonishment and indignation. "You are not Queen of England yet, however," said he to himself, "and it is possible you never may be. What pride! What haughtiness! If I had been a slave, she could not have shown more contempt. When I am Queen of England," said she, "I will not be dictated to." "Queen of England," said she? "Humph! Thinking as I think, and as I am sure everyone else must think, it is possible that that is a contingency that may never arrive. Humph! I will not be dictated to. Humph! Well, certainly I must confess I never heard a more dignified will not in my life." It was the hour when Lord Gustavus was accustomed to hold a kind of levee where the partisans of the princess had been in the habit of assembling, under the guise of casual visitors, and as he thus cogitated, Lord Maysworth and Dr. Hardman were announced. "My dear Lord Gustavus," cried the former, "you cannot imagine how impatient I feel to have tomorrow over. The uniform of the household troops is horrible. I have determined to change it the very instant I am appointed Commander-in-Chief." "If you should obtain that situation," replied Lord Gustavus doubtingly. "What do you mean?" asked his friend, in astonishment. "I thought the means we had taken must infallibly ensure success." "They must ensure the election of Rosabella," replied Lord Gustavus. "And is not that all we wish?" "Not quite," returned Lord Gustavus dryly. "I do not understand you," said Lord Maysworth. "What can you mean?" demanded Dr. Hardman. "I mean," replied Lord Gustavus, in his usual cold, precise manner, "that, thinking as I think, and as I am sure everyone else must think, from the conversation that has just taken place between the princess and myself, I am convinced that our possession of the places she has promised to us is by no means the necessary consequence of her accession to the throne." "Oh," cried his auditors, looking perfectly aghast. A farther explanation confirmed their fears. "I could not have believed it," exclaimed both, and as the partisans of Rosabella continued to arrive, they were successively apprised of and paralyzed by the appalling news. Divers were the sensations thus excited, but amongst all, notwithstanding their professed disinterestedness, there was not one whose sentiments remained unchanged by the intelligence. In the meantime, Rosabella, in the solitude of her own chamber, became aware of the imprudence she had committed, though she brooded in secret over her uneasiness, and felt too proud to avow it even to Marianne, whilst that faithful confidant, quite unsuspicious of the error of her mistress, exulted in her expected triumph with as much transport as though it had been her own. "Tomorrow," said she, "I shall have to do homage to my queen, and I shall have the rapture of seeing crowds kneel humbly at her feet. Oh, would the happy day were come! How tedious will seem this long, long night! How wearisome will be the hours! Does not your heart also throb, my princess? Tomorrow I shall see my queen. Tomorrow! Oh, would it were today!" The important day at last arrived, and the delegates, assembled in Blackheath Square, awaited with impatience the arrival of the princesses. Each was to deliver a speech, after which, a nobleman was to be permitted to address the mob on her behalf, and then the majority of their votes was to decide. The rival princesses appeared, and were hailed with enthusiasm. They were dressed with the utmost simplicity, in the purest white, whilst from their heads hung long veils of gossamer web, the ample folds of which effectually shielded their persons from observation. They were followed by their respective suites, Lord Gustavus and the opposition lords being most conspicuous in that of Rosabella, and Lord Edmund in that of Elvira. The Duke and Sir Ambrose, attended by the Reverend Fathers Morris and Murphy, were amongst the number of spectators, the two former feeling too much agitated to allow of their appearing as actors in the scene, and the others being, from different reasons, equally disqualified from taking a part in it. All now was silent, the tumultuous, wave-like heaving of the multitude ceased, and every one listened in breathless expectation, for the princesses were about to speak. It was an awful moment. The poor old Duke's heart beat almost audibly. he sate, his eyes fixed upon the ground, not daring to look up, and holding the hand of his friend, Sir Ambrose, firmly in his own. It was Rosabella who was to speak first. She advanced with a firm, decided step, and when the attendants drew back the veil that covered her, the assembled multitude uttered a shout of admiration at her beauty. Her dark eyes flashed fire, as she proudly surveyed the crowd, and anticipated triumph gave an animated glow to her fine features. She looked, indeed, already a queen, and seemed born only to command and be obeyed. The multitude were awed by her presence, and listened with uplifted eyes, and the most profound silence, whilst she thus addressed them. My lords and gentlemen, I feel the presumption I am guilty of, in thus venturing to address so august an assembly, but I trust the magnitude of the occasion that calls me forward may afford an excuse for my temerity. I come, gentlemen, to offer myself to you as your sovereign, and the exalted nature of the trust one wish you to repose in me, inspires me with courage to deserve it. Yes, gentlemen, I say to deserve it, for I should consider myself unworthy to be appointed your queen, if I were to shrink from performing any of the duties attendant upon the station, and one of the most arduous of these do I consider that of thus addressing you. I am aware that, upon occasions like the present, it is usual for the aspiring candidate to promise miracles of reformation, that are to be effected upon the obtaining of power. I promise nothing of the kind, for I will tie myself to no promises. Elect me for your queen, and I will fulfill the duties of my rank, according to the best of my own judgment. I will not submit to dictation, neither will I be censured by my subjects. I will be a free, independent sovereign, or I will remain a subject. I scorn to attempt to practice any deception upon you. I wish you to see me as I really am, and then, if you think me worthy of the high office I aspire to, then, at least, I may assure you, you shall never have reason to blush for your choice, nor shall the proud character which England has so long maintained, ever suffer a stain upon its glory at my hands. No, my countrymen, haughty as I may be deemed, I assure you, with sincerity, that I have ever held the name of Englishwoman as my noblest boast, and that I would not relinquish my title to it, were kingdoms offered in exchange. I can say no more. If you approve me as your sovereign, your voices will obtain the fulfillment of your wishes. If you do not, worlds would not tempt me to accept the throne. Rosabella now sate down amidst thunders of applause, whilst acclamations of "Long live Rosabella" rent the air. These symptoms of approbation were, however, only produced by her beauty and her commanding manner, for when men came to analyze her speech, they found much in it to disapprove. The haughty manner in which she had disavowed control, indeed, was neither calculated to win new friends, nor secure those she already had, as the counsellors who had so warmly supported her cause, had certainly not imagined that by so doing, they should shut the door of preferment against themselves, and what hope of promotion or power could remain during the reign of a queen who had thus openly announced her intention of acting entirely for herself. The prejudices of the people, too, were wounded. They had been so accustomed to promises of reformation and relief from taxation, upon the accession of a new sovereign, that they were disappointed at not receiving them, although they knew from experience that they meant nothing, just as persons fond of flattery cannot live without it, though they are well acquainted with its fallacy. Besides, even experience cannot make some people wise, and though the hopes of the English had been so often disappointed, it was pleasant still to have something held out to them to hope for. These thoughts soon arose in the breasts of the multitude, and a rising murmur was beginning to swell upon the ear, when the assembly was hushed to silence by perceiving Lord Noodle had risen, and was about to address them. My lords and gentlemen, said he, it is with feelings of considerable embarrassment that I rise to address you. Everything that can be said, has been said, and everything that has been said, ought to have been said, and everything that ought to have been said, has been said. What, then, can there possibly be left for me to say? Let it not be supposed, however, by my saying this, that I have nothing to say for myself. On the contrary, I think everybody must allow I have said a great deal upon the said subject. Here the noble lord tittered at his own wit, and well it was that he did so, as, if he had not, perhaps nobody might have found it out. Winking Smiley. Say what I will, however, one thing must be clear, and that is, if I was to speak for an hour I could say no more winking smiley, that is, that you must have a queen, and that you cannot choose a better one than the noble lady who has just sat down, and so, gentlemen, she having finished, I think I cannot do better than follow her example. Shouts and roars of laughter followed this speech, to the infinite delight of the enlightened orator, and he bowed and bowed on all sides, till his little head and bobbing periwig seemed to have acquired the gift of perpetual motion. No sooner was the tumult a little subsided, than Elvira came forward to address the people. When her veil was removed, her agitation was extreme. Elvira was delicately fair, and the eloquent blood spoke in her cheeks in 1,000 varying tints. For a few seconds she stood, her eyes fixed upon the ground, apparently endeavoring to collect herself, then raising her eyes, she seemed on the point of speaking, but her courage failing as she surveyed the immense multitude, every eye fixed upon her, and every ear listening for her words, the sounds died upon her lips, and after a few ineffectual attempts to speak, she buried her face in her veil, and sobbed aloud. Who can describe the agitation of her aged father at this moment? When she appeared, he had risen, and, leaning forward, listened with a fearful eagerness, as though his ear would drink in every syllable, and as though his own death warrant hung upon her words. He became pale as he saw her agitation, and his countenance varied with every variation of hers, till, when he saw her total inability to speak, his lips became of livid whiteness, he uttered a piercing shriek, and fell senseless to the ground. A bustle immediately took place, the Duke was carried off, and Elvira remained pale, trembling, and almost fainting, leaning against one of the pillars that supported the canopy over the platform upon which she stood. An awful pause ensued, which was at last broken by Lord Edmund rushing forward, and eagerly addressing the crowd in the following words. My friends and countrymen, if one spark of kindness and compassion dwell in your breasts, if your hearts are open to noble feelings, if you can pity defenseless age and helpless womanhood, listen to me now. Hear me whilst I plead the cause of the timid female now before you, who, agitated by the solemn occasion for which you are convened, and awed by the august majesty of this assembly, finds it impossible to give vent to her feelings in words, for difficult, indeed, is it to express by words the strong emotions of the heart. Oh! Would to heaven, my friends, that I could lay her heart open before you, that you might there read the love of her country, the devotion to your dearest interests, and the generous wish to sacrifice her domestic happiness to secure yours, that prompt her this day to appear before you. Do you fear tyranny? Is this trembling woman likely to impose it? Do you wish remission from oppression? Is not she who evidently possesses such extreme sensibility likely to relieve your cares? Can her breast, which now throbs with emotion, ever be deaf to the cry of misery? No, no, that gentle spirit which shrinks from exposure in the garish light of day, will devote itself to soothing your woes, and lightening your burdens. Do you wish for victory? Has not my arm been hitherto successful, and am I not devoted to Elvira? My countrymen, I plead not from interested motives, God knows I do not. Nay, there may be some among you who know I now plead for the destruction of my dearest hopes, but the welfare of my country is more to me than my own. I give my country the treasure that might have been mine, contented, if by the sacrifice of my own happiness, I can secure that of thousands. My countrymen, I cannot more strongly prove my devotion to your interests, for if you choose Elvira for your queen, my widowed heart will have no bright but glory. Take, however, the treasure I resign to you. Prize her as she deserves, and heaven in its mercy grant that prudent counsellors and sagacious statesmen may so direct her steps, that victory may shine on her banners, wisdom in her counsels, and happiness in her kingdom. Lord Edmund stopped, overpowered by his own emotions, and his agitation found an echo in the bosom of every auditor. The effect of his speech was instantaneous. Cries of Elvira shall be our queen, Elvira forever, rose in deafening tumult from the crowd, nor did there appear a single dissentient voice. In fact, after all that can be said upon the subject, feeling is the only true eloquence. The passions of the crowd were strongly excited, the fainting of the Duke, the agitation of Elvira, and the speech of Lord Edmund, who was the hero of the day, absolutely had driven them distracted. They shouted again and again that Elvira, and Elvira alone, should be queen, and, forming a triumphal car, placed her in it, and dragged her along to Westminster Abbey, where the ceremony of the coronation was appointed to take place. This venerable pile, which had stood for centuries, and resisted alike the war of nature, and the destroying hand of innovation, with which the barbarous taste of the Middle Ages had endeavored to destroy its grandeur, shone forth in all its original splendor, and afforded another magnificent proof of the length of time the labors of man survived the term of his fragile existence. It had been a brilliant sight, when Westminster Hall was crowded with the nobles of the land, to choose the Council of State, but far more splendid was it now, when, after the religious part of the ceremony of the coronation had been performed in the Abbey, the trembling and beautiful Queen entered its sumptuous walls, surrounded by her councillors, and welcomed with transport by her kneeling subjects. All had been previously prepared for the ceremony, as the ordinance of the old Queen had directed the coronation to take place immediately after the election, and the venerable hall was now crowded with the nobles and ladies of Claudia's court, splendidly attired, waiting for the Queen, whom the choice of the deputies might give them, with the most eager impatience. Elvira was received with transports, and though, perhaps, under different circumstances, her rival might have been honored with equal rapture, yet, as Elvira knew it not, the thought did not damp her pleasure. In the meantime Father Maurice had remained aghast, a prey to the combined tortures of grief, rage, and disappointment. The crowd had disappeared, yet still he stood gazing upon the platform, the speechless image of despair. "For heaven's sake, do not remain here," cried a voice he knew only too well, and, obeying the impulse of Marianne's arm, he suffered himself to be led from the scaffold, where all his hopes had perished. There was a small house, at no great distance from the spot, where the partisans of Rosabella had held frequent conferences respecting their plans for securing her election, and to this place Marianne led the disappointed friar. "Curses on the fiend that has betrayed me to my ruin," said he, as he threw himself upon a sofa in this abode. "May demons haunt him here, and eternal misery be his portion hereafter." The fiendish laugh of Cheops rang in the father's ears as he pronounced these words, and ere he finished, the hated form of the mummy stood before him. "What, Father Maurice," cried the Egyptian, "is this your treatment of your friends? Fie! Fie! Is this your strength of mind? I am ashamed of you. Is it the part of a man of courage to shrink from such a slight reverse? However, I am still your friend, and if you will follow my advice." "Avaunt! Demon," cried Father Maurice, "tempt me no more. Ruin hangs upon thy words, and it is thy advice that has destroyed me." "Say rather, your own evil passions," returned the mummy. "Fiend," exclaimed the monk, "was it not by thy advice Rosabella rejected the address I had prepared for her, and determined to deliver her own sentiments extempore? Such an expression of her genuine feelings was likely to produce 10 times the effect of a studied address. The oration of Lord Edmund was from the feeling of the moment, and you saw its power was magical. And it was not by your desire that the fool Lord Noodle seconded her, instead of Lord Gustavus, as I had intended. A ridiculous fool was more likely to put the people in good humor than a prosing one. Yes, yes, I know, it was thus you made your plans seem feasible, but how have they succeeded? Success is not always the test of merit. How could I foresee the fainting of the Duke, and the agitation of Elvira? That timid silence said far more for her than words. If she had spoken, she would have had no chance. "Would she were dead," said Father Maurice, grinding his teeth. "So would you seal your ruin. Rosabella would be suspected, and her chance of reigning destroyed forever. What shall I do? Let Elvira reign, nay, start not. For it is but for a time. She will naturally make Edmund her first counsellor from gratitude for the service he has rendered her, and, as he has sense and talent, he will as naturally either reject employing the noble lords who were your friends entirely, or, at best, give them but subordinate situations. Their hopes having been previously raised, they will feel this disappointment bitterly, and look back with longing eyes to Rosabella, by whom they were promised place and power. That princess must moderate her natural haughtiness. If she wish to reign, she must submit to bend before she rise, for, though ambition be the most lofty of all passions, perhaps no one makes its votaries occasionally condescend to greater meanness. At present patience alone is required. Novelty is always delightful, but the pleasure it produces can never be lasting, and the expectations of men having been raised too high by the brilliancy with which a new government is certain to commence, they will soon be disposed to quarrel with everything that may chance to fall short of the standard they will then propose to themselves, though this same standard, if they give themselves time to consider, they would find far too exalted for mortals to have ever any hopes of reaching. Their extravagant expectations not being realized, they will then plunge into the opposite extreme. They will see everything with a jaundiced eye, and, not liking to own they find themselves deceived, they will overturn the government of Elvira to conceal forever the folly they have been guilty of. But will not the government of Rosabella afterwards share the same fate? No, for they will have learnt wisdom by experience, and having just suffered from the inconveniences inseparable from a revolution, they will idolize every word and action of Rosabella, to spare themselves the necessity of again undergoing the same horrors, and yet avoid the charge of inconsistency. They will thus fear even to censure, and will gloss over anything that may not quite please them, rather than run the risk of again interrupting that tranquility which the late disturbance has made them taste the sweets of. The sophistry of Cheops was well suited to the feelings of his hearers, and well did he know how to work upon the passions of those he conversed with. The indignation of Father Maurice and Marianne subsided, and they again became the Egyptians' devoted slaves. Cheops watched them as they retired, a smile of derision curling his haughty lip. "Fools that they are," said he, as again a fearful expression flashed across his saturnine countenance, "by Typhon! They are scarcely worth deceiving, for they rush blindfold into the net." In the meantime, nothing could exceed the grandeur of the scene exhibiting in Westminster Hall. The ceremony was finished, for the Queen had taken oaths of fidelity to the interests of her new subjects, and had received their humblest homage in return. A sumptuous banquet was now served, where all that could please the eye mingled in luxuriant profusion with all that could tempt the appetite. Music completed the charm, and as the harmonious notes swelled through the lofty dome, it seemed a choir of angels rejoicing from on high. Thus, whilst all that could gratify the senses was combined, the fairy loveliness of Elvira seemed to fit her well to be the goddess of the scene, and the figure of the poor old Duke, her father, gazing at her with indescribable rapture, the tears trickling down his furrowed cheeks, and his long white hair hanging loose upon his shoulders, completed the interest of the picture. Great and glorious was the triumph of Elvira, but, whilst the nation rang with acclamations of joy, and bonfires and illuminations proclaimed the transport of the people, who shall paint the despair, the desolation, of the unfortunate Rosabella? Forlorn and deserted by her friends, despised and injured by him she loved, disappointed in the fairy dreams of her ambition, and disgusted with a world that had rejected her, what could she do? Where find a refuge from her woes? Rosabella sought no refuge. Wretched as she was, her proud spirit still supported her. She neither retired from society, nor gave herself up to the paroxysms of despair. Hers was not a mind to brood over useless grief. She felt her wrongs, it is true, and most keenly did she feel them, but she wasted not her time in lamentation, and burnt only to avenge them. Marianne had communicated to her the advice of Cheops, and her whole soul was now devoted to revenge. For this, she determined to obey his injunctions, to bend her haughty spirit to his wishes, to conciliate the friends that had deserted her, and to submit to any meanness to keep up a party in the state. This done, she resolved to watch for the errors unavoidable in a new government, to take advantage of every weakness, and foment every discontent, in short, to open a chasm under her rival's feet, and then, like the lion Pismire on the brink of his sandy trap, to rest concealed until the entanglement of the expected prey enabled her to rush upon and destroy it. Elvira's disposition was naturally noble, and, satisfied with the possession of the throne, she sought no farther triumph. Her generous soul was touched by the apparent resignation of her rival, and she endeavored, by every means in her power, to console her for her disappointment. The Duke had quitted the country, and now resided entirely with his daughter, whilst upon Rosabella, Elvira, with the utmost delicacy, conferred a palace and a separate establishment. Notwithstanding, however, the delicacy with which Elvira's favours were conferred, Rosabella could not forget that they were favours, and hers was not a mind to brook dependence. Her hatred for her cousin thus increased with the weight of her obligations, whilst that of Elvira had vanished with the occasion that gave it birth. It is, indeed, scarcely possible for a proud, haughty temper, like that of Rosabella, to love the person to whom it owes everything. Such dispositions find infinitely more pleasure in obliging, than in being obliged, pride being gratified in one case and humbled in the other. People are thus often devotedly attached to their protégés, as they seem, in some measure, creations of their own, and lavish favours upon them with a profuse hand, but they often expect such devotion in return, that love withers into slavery, or changes into hatred, and what was once gratitude, soon becomes mortification. Elvira had an arduous part to sustain. It was difficult to find the medium between giving too much or too little, and more difficult still, to discover a means of giving at all, without hurting the feelings of Rosabella. The sense she had of this, rendered the manner of Elvira towards her cousin, occasionally, cold and restrained, and Rosabella felt acutely the slightest change. She, indeed, saw everything with a jaundiced eye, she imagined insults, where none were intended, she shrank from the slightest observation, that could be supposed to allude to her present situation, and she appeared to feel so much pain whenever she was in the society of Elvira, that the intercourse between the cousins gradually dwindled to a mere formal interchange of visits, and the customary ceremonials of court etiquette. The cousins thus completely estranged from each other, Rosabella's palace became the resort of the discontented. The King of Ireland had died soon after the departure of the Duke of Cornwall for the country, and those malcontents, formerly in his pay, being repulsed by his son, now crowded round Rosabella. Men of talents, but of dissolute habits, daring spirits that preyed upon themselves for want of employment, and desperate characters, to whom every change was agreeable, as they had nothing to lose, and everything to hope for by a revolution, vied with each other in devoting themselves to her service. It was often grating to Rosabella's feelings to associate with wretches such as these, but to what cannot proud spirits sometimes submit, to gain the determined purpose of their souls? Everything is swallowed up in one vast overwhelming passion, and minor difficulties are neither seen, thought of, nor felt. Thus, Rosabella scrupled not to waste her time in the society of such beings as Lord Noodle and his friend Lord Doodle. She even stooped to flatter them, and occasionally to ask, and appear to follow their advice. She endured patiently the dictatorial prosing of Lord Gustavus, and listened with an appearance of interest to the wearisome pettinesses of Lord Maysworth. All she thought of was whether any particular line of conduct were likely to conduce to placing her on the throne, and if it were, be it what it might, the haughty Rosabella instantly condescended to practice it. Taught by the late events not to rely too confidently upon her own strength, she rushed into the opposite extreme, and descended even unto servility. In the meantime, the attention of Elvira was completely devoted to the establishment of her government. She had many qualities worthy of her rank, and some of the most conspicuous were her nobleness in forgetting injuries, and her inflexible sense of justice. Thus, though she had made no promises herself to her people on the day of her election, she justly considered those made by Edmund on her part as equally binding, and endeavoured by every means in her power to redeem the pledges he had given. Cheops had judged rightly in supposing she would make Edmund her prime minister. Her gratitude to him, indeed, was unbounded, and though her noble and generous disposition prevented her depriving the lords who had voted against her of their dignities, yet that the strong mind, and commanding genius of Edmund would make them dwindle into nonentities, he had also been equally correct in predicting. The noble lords, quite unconscious of their own inefficiency, were indignant at finding themselves subalterns where they had hoped to be commanders, and rallied round the standard of Rosabella, who, on her part, received them so graciously, that her former haughtiness was forgotten. Elvira was not aware of their defection, or if she were, she thought them too insignificant to merit notice, her attention being entirely occupied in affairs which she considered of infinitely more importance. Though the laws of the old queen had been excellent, many abuses had crept into the manner of putting them into execution, and these Elvira now, with the aid of Edmund, set herself diligently to work to discover and correct. She could not, indeed, have chosen an assistant more competent to the task. The penetrating mind and commanding genius of Edmund were unequalled. With a single glance, he saw where errors had been committed, and how they ought to be amended. Whilst under his auspices, vice was punished and virtue rewarded, goodness, though in rags, was raised to affluence, and villainy compelled to disgorge its ill-gotten wealth. Justice was impartially dispensed to all, and the first Monday in every month, the Queen proceeded in solemn state to the Grand Square at Blackheath, to receive there, in person, the petitions of her subjects. The crowd assembled upon these occasions was immense. However well a constitution may be organized, it is impossible to give satisfaction to every one, and even under the best regulated governments there will be always some who fancy themselves aggrieved. Besides, as free access was allowed on these occasions to every one, numbers went merely to see the Queen, and nothing could be better contrived for letting Her Majesty know the real feelings of her subjects, than this arrangement, as, from the people being placed in lines, along each of which the Queen walked, she became alternately in personal contact with every separate individual. Like everything else, however, that sounds perfect in theory, difficulties arose when this plan came to be put in practice. It was originally intended that the Queen should receive, with her own hands, and read herself, all the petitions that might be presented, but when it was found their numbers frequently amounted to some thousands, this scheme was abandoned as impracticable, and the Lords Noodle and Doodle were appointed to the important office of walking behind the Queen, carrying large bags, in which the petitions were deposited, and from which they would probably never again have emerged, if they had not been dragged to light by the persevering and indefatigable exertions of Lord Edmund. The people, however, were not aware of this, and there was something in the show that delighted them. It was indeed a fine sight, to behold so many hundreds of human beings anxiously watching the movements of their beautiful Queen, as she glided along their ranks, smiling graciously upon all, and looking like an angel sent upon earth to dispense blessings to mankind, ladies of honor walking behind her, with pages bearing their train, and the two aged councillors of state, bending beneath the weight of their ponderous bags, bringing up the rear. Thus gloriously commenced Elvira's reign. The people, delighted with the attention paid to their wishes, and struck by some instances of the Queen's love of justice and hatred of oppression, lauded her to the skies. The nobility, hoping riches and power from her liberality, almost worshipped her, and the ambassadors of foreign powers, dreading the valor of Lord Edmund and his soldiers, offered the humblest homage at her feet. In short, all seemed to smile upon her, and the kingdom to bid fair shortly to rival even the imagined happiness of Utopia itself. Chapter 19. In the meantime, what had become of Edric and Dr. Entwerfen? Gloomy indeed were the reflections of our travellers when they found themselves immured in a dungeon, so far from all they loved or reverenced, without friends, and accused of a horrible crime, from the guilt of which they felt it would be vain for them to attempt to free themselves. Days and weeks rolled on, yet no change took place in their destiny. Every night the grating of a rusty key in the lock announced the arrival of the gaoler, bringing their daily pittance of bread and water, but he never spoke, nor could the most earnest entreaties of the doctor and Edric bring one word from his lips. Despair at length began to invade the bosoms of the travellers, till one day, as they were examining, for the 1000th time, the hieroglyphics on the stones in the wall, Edric perceived that one of them was loose. With infinite difficulty they removed the stone, and found a long vaulted passage, dimly lighted by an opening at the farther extremity. The transport of the prisoners, on making this discovery, was unbounded, and can only be imagined by those who have felt the loss of liberty, and rejoiced at its recovery. When their first raptures had a little abated, they began to consult upon the best means of availing themselves of their good fortune, and preventing pursuit. The doctor had luckily several chemical preparations in his walking stick. With one of these he dissolved the iron of their chains, so as to free Edric and himself from their weight, and then, smearing them over with the remainder of the composition, he laid them in a heap, exclaiming with a laugh, "The jailers will be dreadfully frightened when they find these fetters, for though they look perfect to the eye, they will crumble to pieces at the slightest touch." Edric was too anxious to effect his escape, to listen to his tutor's exultation, and his arrangements being made, the travellers, with trembling steps and throbbing hearts, explored the vaulted passage, and found, to their infinite delight, that it had led them to the borders of the Nile. A small boat was anchored to the shore, and its crew, an old man and his son, who gained their living by conveying goods up the Nile, were peaceably taking their supper on the bank. Edric and the doctor had taken the precaution to replace the stone that had concealed the vaulted passage, and having smeared the opposite wall with phosphorus, they had no doubt that when the jailer entered the prison, which he generally did in darkness, he would be too much alarmed to take any effectual means for pursuing them till it should be too late. Having luckily also plenty of money, that certain road to the human heart, they easily persuaded the old man to take them on board, and in a short time they embarked in his fragile vessel and set sail. Slowly and silently they floated along the majestic river, which rolled in solemn waves like an inland sea, and swept proudly on to the ocean, seeming to scorn the degenerate land it left behind, and without one pang did our travellers quit for ever the fertile plains and gorgeous cities of Egypt. One only thought swelled in their bosoms, and that was joy at their escape. Offering up silent prayers of thanksgiving, our travellers continued their progress down the river, and, when morning dawned, and the enormous forms of the pyramids were seen grimly frowning through the mist, they shuddered involuntarily, and, devoutly crossing themselves, muttered new prayers for protection and deliverance. After a long and tedious voyage, our travellers at length reached the sea in safety. The mouths of the delta were at that time the seat of extensive, and almost universal commerce, and our travellers trembled lest they should here encounter some emissary of their enemies, who might reconvey them to the prison from which they had so miraculously escaped. They found, however, the belief of their supernatural disappearance too strongly impressed upon the minds of the multitude for even a suspicion of their existence to remain, and they stood upon that sumptuous quay, surrounded by Greeks, Russians, Egyptians, Arabs, and Turks, without exciting a single remark, or obtaining the slightest attention. They wished to proceed to Constantinople, then the capital of the powerful Empire of Greece, and entered into conversation with the master of a felucca, for that purpose. "I will attend to you directly, gentlemen," said the sailor, leaving some persons with whom he had been previously talking, "but I have been listening to such a horrid tale." "What was it?" asked Edric, suspecting the subject, but aware that to seem incurious upon such an occasion might betray that they were already only too well informed. "Two sorcerers," returned the man, "have been taken into custody, for blowing up the pyramids and bewitching the mummies." "And how were they punished?" asked Edric. "Oh, you haven't heard half they did yet," said the man. When they were put in prison for their pranks, the Old One came to their help, and carried them off in a flame of fire, leaving a long train of light after them in the sky, like the tail of a blazing comet. Dick Jones, who was telling me, swears he saw them all going off together. The Old One hanging by the devil's horn, and the young one keeping fast hold of his tail. Shocking, said Edric, scarcely able, however, to repress a smile at this proof of the vividness of Dick Jones's imagination. I haven't told you half, resumed the man. All Sumatra rings with it, several have gone mad, and others died with fear, and the man who was with Dick Jones, and who was one of the soldiers of the guard set over them, assured me as a positive fact that the chains they had on, and left behind them, crumbled between his fingers like a bit of rotten wood. It is very awful, said Edric. Is it not, rejoined the man, thank God I was not there to see. I am sure the very look of one of those conjurers would have driven me mad. I never could abide such things. Edric now, with some difficulty, persuaded the man to return to the subject of their transit. I am very sorry, sir, said he, but I don't think there will be a vessel going out to Constantinople for this week at least, for they've got the plague there, and our magistrates won't let a ship that has been there return to our harbour again without performing quarantine, and that is such a hindrance to trade that our folks don't like it. But perhaps you're in no hurry, and can wait. Oh yes, we can wait quite well, said the doctor, trembling with anxiety to be off. The sailor, however, had no occasion to say more, for the bare mention of the plague was quite sufficient to deter our travellers from visiting Constantinople, and finding he was bound for Malta, and that no other vessel would quit the harbour that day, they hastily embarked, notwithstanding his vessel was old and inconvenient, and not forwarded by steam, and though the superior certainty of the steam packets was now so generally felt and acknowledged by all, that perhaps this was the only common sailing boat in the harbour. The joy of our travellers at their deliverance was, however, too great to permit them to dwell upon trifles, and as the cabin was scarcely habitable, they resolved to remain on deck the whole of the voyage, being determined to submit to anything sooner than delay their departure. Accordingly they stretched themselves upon their cloaks, and, reclining against some ropes, watched attentively the lovely scene around them. The evening was beautiful, and, as the shores of Egypt swiftly receded from their view, they felt their minds soothed by the contemplation of the grand scene that presented itself. There is, indeed, something in the awful majesty of the world of waters, which, like the gigantic monuments of Egypt, powerfully affects the mind by its very simplicity, and, by raising the soul far above the common trifling occurrences of life, soothes it to tranquility. The voyage was long, for contrary winds impeded their progress, and one evening, after Dr. Entwerfen had remained for some time gazing steadfastly on the water, with a look of deep abstraction, he exclaimed suddenly, "There will be a storm." "Impossible," returned Edric. "The sun set in unwonted splendor, spreading its rays of purple and gold through the waters like a jeweled diadem, and the wind is even now dying away to a gentle breeze, which scarcely curls the surface of the ocean as our bark dances gaily over it." "That is a bad sign," said the doctor. "Have you not often heard that a storm is generally preceded by a calm? You will find it no metaphor now." The moon soon shone brightly, and as the ship ploughed her way slowly through the almost motionless waves, its beams sparkled through the spray, which fell in silvery showers over the prow. All now was still, except the heaving of the vessel, and the monotonous splashing of the waters as she slowly worked her way through them. The wind gradually sunk, and the sails only feebly flapped in the breeze that could no longer inflate them, till at last even that failed, and the vessel, completely becalmed, lay like a log upon the water, which spread like a vast and tranquil mirror around her. Bitterly now did our travellers regret the precipitate haste that had made them embark in such a frail, unmanageable boat, and they regarded with longing eyes the compact steam packets that glided past them, their black smoke curling in the air as they were wafted swiftly along. It was too late, however, to repent, and the doctor consoled himself by taking advantage of the effect produced by the thick black smoke, as they saw it rising in the distance, to illustrate the lecture he had formerly given his pupil, on the theory of combustion and decomposition of amphites, till he fairly lulled him to sleep. Morning came, but brought not with it the wished-for breeze. Edric rose, and walking upon deck, encountered the doctor. "How still all seems," said he. "Nature seems to sleep, but 'tis an awful stillness, such as falls upon a dying patient, prophetic of his end. Nature seems exhausted, and I could fancy is seeking a short repose to rally her energies for some decisive blow." "You are fanciful, Edric," said the doctor. "You alarm yourself unnecessarily. The violent shock your nerves have sustained unfits you for exertion, and renders you disposed to see everything in a gloomy light." "I beg your pardon, sir," said a ragged English sailor, who happened to be on board. "In my opinion the gentleman is right, for everything portends a storm. Cirrostrati streak the sky, and as they join with the fleecy cumuli below them in cumulus strati, nothing can more clearly indicate wind and rain, and probably thunder. And see, too, how the dark, frowning nimbus spreads its black shade along the edge of the horizon, and how the birds fly cowering, almost touching the waters with their wings as they flit along. Now it begins, hark!" Whilst the sailor had been speaking, the clouds had thickened gradually, and the sky had grown dark as night. A hollow murmuring was heard, which seemed to gather fury as it came, till it burst over the devoted vessel with terrific violence, and rent the sails to atoms, whistling round in fearful gusts, as though mocking the mischief it had done. The sea now heaved mountains high. The forked lightning played like writhing serpents along the deep black sky, now streaming like floating ribbons in the air, and then darting downwards like fiery arrows. Thunder rolled heavily in the distance, approaching however nearer and nearer, every peal reverberating through the sky, as though echoed back by unseen rocks, till at last a tremendous crash announced the fall of the electric fluid. Our travellers were preparing to retire below, when, just as they reached the cabin stairs, the heavens seemed to open, and a ball of light blue fire, of a most vivid brightness, shot downwards from the chasm, and struck the mast of the labouring ship. Immediately after, a loud crackling noise rattled over their heads, and then all again was still, save the howling winds, and the groans of some prostrate seamen, wounded by the scattered fragments of the splintered mast. The rain now descended in torrents, and the feeble vessel, at one moment raised to a fearful height, then dashed down, and apparently engulfed by the heavy seas that washed over her, seemed every instant doomed to destruction, and to escape only by a miracle. The shouts of the seamen, and creaking of the strained timbers of the ship, mingled horribly with the howling of the wind, and roar of the billows. Every instant it was expected she must go to pieces, for she had sprung a leak, and the water rose so fast as to baffle every attempt made to check its progress. The seamen were now in despair. They broke open their trunks, and dressing themselves in their best clothes, they filled their pockets with all the valuables they could find. Then, whilst some went to prayers, others broke open the captain's spirit chest, and many rolled overboard in a state of intoxication, whilst the ship, now become a perfect wreck, drifted before the wind, and was rapidly sinking. The storm, however, seeming to abate, the master ordered out the boat, and all the seamen who retained their senses, eagerly sprang on board. Our travellers attempted to follow, but the seamen pushed them back, and exclaiming the boat was full, rowed off, leaving them to their fate. The English sailor had been in the act of stepping on board the boat, the very moment she pushed off, and the sudden shock precipitated him into the sea. A piercing scream burst from his lips, as his body, with a dying effort, sprang from the waves, which seemed to rise after him and suck him back into their gulf. Our friends heard the cry, and rushed to the side of the vessel, but alas! They were powerless to save him. The ship drifted rapidly by. They saw his hands gleam for a moment through the waves, as he raised them in agony, and then the roaring billows rolled on, deep, black, and gloomy as before. The horror of Edric and the doctor was excessive, but the impending terrors of their own fate prevented the possibility of their minds dwelling long upon his. The storm, however, visibly abated, and the dismantled hulk they were upon, lightened by the desertion of the sailors, still swam, light, fleecy clouds now scudded rapidly along the skies, and the moon, struggling to break forth from behind them, shed a faint and watery gleam upon the scene. Our travelers now, by the feeble light afforded by the moonbeams, perceived the boat laboring heavily through the dark grey sea, and struggling to reach a long black line of rocks, distinctly marked in the distance, against which the still boiling waters broke with tremendous roar, curling in whitened foam as they laved their craggy sides, whilst the wreck our travellers were upon seemed rapidly drifting upon the same point. Death now appeared inevitable, as it was impossible their shattered bark could resist the shock, if it should be tossed against these jagged crags, and every moment she seemed rising upon a wave that must dash her upon them, and floating back to escape only by a miracle. The doctor and Edric became giddy with these repeated shocks, and in despair fancied themselves resigned, or rather, stunned by the misfortunes which had followed each other with such overwhelming rapidity upon their devoted heads. They awaited their fate with an apathy which they mistook for resignation. The seamen in the boat still continued laboring on, straining every nerve to reach the shore, though ineffectually, for the foaming surge beat them back with resistless violence. With anxious eyes and beating hearts, our friends marked the progress of the boat, till, giddy with watching, and feeling their spirits exhausted as they surveyed the fruitless struggle of the toiling boatmen, they hid their faces with their hands, and shut it from their sight. At this instant a wild and piercing cry rang in their ears. 'Twas from the boat. She had swamped, the human beings she contained were all swallowed up in the boiling waves, and that shriek of agony was their funeral knell. A horrid silence followed this appalling scream, unbroken save by the lashing of the billows against the rocks, and the low, half-suppressed moaning of the winds, till the senses of the travellers became bewildered, and they shrieked in agony. Their peril indeed grew every moment more intense, for every wave carried them nearer and nearer to those frowning crags, whilst their dark sides, rearing themselves in awful majesty, seemed mustering their strength to repel the insolent intruders that sought to invade their territory. The doctor and Edric, in the meantime, suffering 1,000 deaths in the protracted horrors they were compelled to endure, and which they could neither mitigate nor evade, shrank back with the shivering of affrighted nature trembling at dissolution, every time the wave on which their vessel floated seemed to dash against the shore. At length, however, the fate they had so long dreaded arrived. Their shattered hulk was raised on a tremendous billow, and thrown with fearful violence upon the rocks, with a force that shivered it to atoms, and engulfed the doctor and Edric in the boiling surge. The next wave, however, returning, swept them along in its bosom, and threw them, perfectly insensible, though locked in each other's arms, upon the shore. Chapter 20. It was morning, and the glowing sunbeams danced gaily on the sparkling waters of the dark blue deep, as, gently rippling, it laved the rocky shore on which Edric and his tutor had been thrown, and seemed to smile, as if in mockery of the mischiefs it had wrought. There, sheltered by a rock, whose jutting crag had saved them from being carried back into the devouring ocean, lay our travellers, apparently buried in sleep, returning consciousness not having yet dispelled the torpor produced by the fearful terrors of the night. The sun now shone brightly, and its glowing heat revived Edric from his trance. Slowly and heavily he unclosed his languid eyes, and, forgetting where he was, attempted to rise. He succeeded, but weak and dizzy, he only staggered a few paces ere he again fell. The roaring of the ocean still sounded in his ears, his senses swam, and, giddy and enfeebled by his previous exhaustion, he fancied himself still tossed upon the foaming billows. For some time, he lay in a state of torture, the thrill of returning circulation tingling through his veins, till the recollection of what had passed flashing across his mind, he again endeavored to rouse himself, and seek his tutor. The unfortunate doctor, however, appeared to be no more, and as Edric gazed upon his inanimate form, he might have exclaimed with Prince Henry, "I could have better spared a better man." At this moment Edric recollected the strong chemical preparations the doctor generally carried about him, and, searching his pockets, found a potent elixir. With some difficulty, he forced a few drops down his throat, taking a dose also himself. The effects of the medicine were soon visible. The doctor heaved a deep sigh, and, opening his eyes, gazed vacantly around, whilst Edric himself felt perfectly restored. "Where am I?" cried Dr. Entwerfen, as soon as he was sufficiently recovered to speak, and then, as some of the horrors he had so lately witnessed recurred to his mind, he exclaimed, "I will never disclose it, no torture shall compel me. Where is the justice?" He fled away in a flame of fire hanging to the devil's horn. "Ah, Edric! Where are we? Ah! I have had such a horrid dream." "Alas," returned Edric, "it is but too real." "What? What?" cried the doctor, getting up and staring wildly around him. "I remember now, we were drowned, but where are we?" "I know not," replied his pupil mournfully. "You forget I have been exposed to the same perils as yourself, and that I am equally ignorant where fate has thrown us. I should think, however, from the position we were in when the storm began, that we are somewhere on the shores of the Mediterranean, but whether in Europe or Africa, I have as yet had no means of ascertaining." "We must explore," said the doctor solemnly. "We ought not to remain in doubt another instant upon so important a subject. Follow me." They now quitted the rocky beach on which they had so long lain, and advanced towards some cliffs which shut them out from the view of the surrounding country. When they had surmounted this natural barrier, they found the prospect that presented itself superb, and their eyes wandered with delight over orange groves and forests of cork trees, whilst the green shining leaves, and rich scarlet blossoms of the pomegranates, and light tender waving foliage of the olive, afforded variety to the scene. The burning heat of the sun's rays felt softened by the breezes from the sea, a balmy fragrance seemed to pervade the air, birds flew twittering around them, or, perched upon the branches of the trees, made the groves resound with melodious harmony, whilst butterflies of the most brilliant colors fluttered from flower to flower, and innumerable buzzing insects seemed to fill the air with motion. "What a lovely country," said the doctor, as he and Edric penetrated into the deep recesses of a shady grove, "and how delightful is this sensation of refreshing coolness, after having been exposed to the burning rays of the sun. It is yet early, for the sun has not yet reached far above the horizon, and the dewdrops still glisten in his rays like diamonds hanging from every leaf. Where can we be? Surely we are not dead, and now in paradise." Edric smiled. "I rather think," said he, "that we are in Andalusia. I have often read of the exquisite beauty of some of the southern provinces of Spain, and this seems well to accord with the ideas I have always entertained of that country." They now approached what appeared to be a cemetery, and which was tastefully adorned with weeping willows hanging over the graves, whilst roses, and 1,000 beautiful flowering shrubs, flourishing in wild luxuriance from the genial nature of the climate, spread around, and gave this receptacle of the mouldering remains of mortality the aspect of a blooming garden. "How different from the pyramids!" exclaimed the doctor and Edric at the same moment. "The tombstones seem to have inscriptions upon them," continued the former, after a short pause. "Let us approach and examine them. They will at least declare the country we are in, by the language in which they may be written." The idea struck Edric as feasible, and they entered the cemetery. "You are right, Edric," said the doctor, "we are in Spain, for here lie the mortal remains of Don Alfonso, that mighty hero of the Bourbon race, who, you doubtless remember, was the first that conquered the northern part of Africa, and by transferring the seat of the Spanish Empire to Fez, contributed so powerfully to the civilization and conversion to Christianity of all that vast territory. And who destroyed Spain as a monarchy, by so doing," added Edric. "It is true," replied the doctor, "that Spain, finding itself too mighty for a province, shook off in consequence the yoke of his descendants, and erected its present republic, which it most probably would never have done if the seat of government had remained at Madrid. But that is trifling compared with the inestimable benefits produced to the world at large, by the civilization and reduction to a Christian state, of such a mighty empire as that of Morocco. Had it not been for that, we might still have remained in the degrading ignorance in which mankind were immersed for so many centuries respecting the interior of Africa. Timbuktu would never have risen to its present eminence in science and commerce, the real course of the Niger would never have been discovered, and the sources of the Nile still remained wrapped in oblivion. Yes, mighty shade. Thou wert indeed a hero. Calumny may assail thy fame, and unenlightened minds cavil at the wonders of thy glory, but one firm and attached votary still remains to thee, and thus he humbly bends to do thee homage. So saying, the doctor prostrated himself upon the tomb, and reverentially kissed the cold marble inscribed with the hero's name. "Hold! Hold!" cried a man, rushing from behind a small temple, and seizing him, whilst in an instant Edric and his tutor found themselves surrounded by soldiers, whose grim visages spoke them inured to blood and warfare. "Wretch," exclaimed the leader, apostrophizing the terrified doctor, "but thy life shall soon pay the forfeit of thy crimes. Away with him," continued he, addressing his soldiers, "bear him before the next Alcaide, and let him there suffer the punishment the law enacts against all those who dare to praise the actions or worship the memory of the tyrannic Alfonso. Away with him, I say." "Mercy! Mercy!" implored the doctor. "Impossible," said the leader sternly. "Do you not know that this is a land of liberty, and that we abhor the very name of tyranny and oppression? How then can the admirer of a tyrant hope for mercy at our hands? Away with him, I say, and with his companion too, for as they appear to be associates, no doubt their principles are the same." "And do you call this a land of liberty?" asked Edric reproachfully. "Hear him! He blasphemes," cried the soldiers. "Gag him if he dare again to breathe such impiety," and amidst their shouts and execrations, Edric and his tutor were dragged away. Taught by this lesson that the liberty of the Republican Spaniards did not extend to the tolerance of any opinions except their own, Edric and the doctor did not again venture to speak, and they soon, to their infinite dismay, found themselves in the presence of the Alcaide, who, however, luckily for our travellers, happened to be a man of some sense and liberality. He smiled when he heard the substance of the facts gravely stated against the prisoners. "This case requires a private hearing," said he. "Velasquez, conduct the prisoners to my own apartment." "We will have no private hearing," clamored the people and the soldiers. "The crime was public, and the punishment should be so too. We will not be gulled." "But, gentlemen," said the magistrate, "supposing these prisoners to be part of a gang of conspirators who have been plotting against the state, it might defeat the ends of justice to have them examined publicly, as it is possible, mind, gentlemen, I only say, as it is possible, some traitors may lurk even among the crowd before me, who might give intelligence to other parties interested, who might be thus enabled to make their escape." "Now you speak reason," said the mob. "We are always willing to listen to reason," and without farther remonstrance they permitted the Alcaide and the prisoners to retire. "You see, gentlemen," said the Alcaide, shutting the door of the room carefully, and placing chairs, in which he invited his prisoners to sit down, "that all is not liberty which is called so, and that a mob can occasionally be as tyrannical as an emperor. I know that in reality there is not a shadow of complaint against you, yet I dare not release you, as my own life would be the forfeit if I did. You must thus submit to a temporary restraint, which you may rest assured I shall not only endeavor to shorten, but shall render as light as possible whilst I am compelled to inflict it." "My dear sir," said the doctor, "we are exceedingly obliged by your kindness. If we had not met with you, I do not know what would have become of us. I could not have believed people were in existence so illiberal as these Spaniards, or that any human beings could be so weak as to fancy themselves in a land of liberty whilst they are practicing the most refined tyranny." "And yet my countrymen are neither fools nor hypocrites," returned the Alcaide, "but, like many other people, they deceive themselves, and talk about freedom till they fancy they possess it. Their great fault, however, has been, that they did not know where to stop, and as even virtue becomes vice when carried to the extreme, so have the most sublime principles of liberty and patriotism become degraded in their hands, by being attempted to be carried to an exaggerated degree of perfection." "Oh, England! England," sighed the doctor, "would to heaven I had never left thy happy shores. Alas! Alas! What a crowd of horrible events have occupied the last few months. Why did you leave your country, since you so bitterly regret it? Demanded the Alcaide. Because we could not be contented, replied Edric. Devoted from my earliest youth to the pursuits of science, I craved ardently for knowledge denied to mortals. I aspired to penetrate into the profoundest secrets of nature, and burnt to accomplish wishes destined never to be realized. The desire of seeing foreign countries also filled my soul. I longed to travel, to acquire new ideas and meet with strange and wonderful adventures. I sickened of the quiet and tranquility of home. Give me change, cried I in my madness, give me variety, and I ask no more, for even wretchedness itself were better to bear than this tiresome unvarying uniformity. The unreasonableness of my wishes deserved punishment, and I have been cursed with the very fulfillment of my wishes. Is this gentleman also a votary of science? Asked the Alcaide, who had appeared musing whilst Edric spoke. What a question! Exclaimed the doctor, in a transport of indignation. What? Has my whole life been devoted to scientific pursuits? Have I deprived myself of rest and almost of food? And wasted the midnight lamp in bringing to perfection some of the most sublime discoveries ever vouchsafed to man, to be insulted suited with such a doubt as that? No, sir, that you see before you Dr. Entwerfen, the fortunate inventor of the immortalizing snuff, one single pinch of which cures all diseases by the smell, the discoverer of the capability of caoutchouc being applied to aerial purposes, and the maker of the most compendious and powerful galvanic battery ever yet beheld by mortal. Then you are the very man I want, said the Alcaide. Go to prison contentedly, and rest satisfied that your confinement will be of very short duration. In a day or two I will see you, and explain the project I have conceived for your deliverance. So saying, he summoned his guards, and, ordering them to convey the travellers to prison, the doctor and Edric were dragged away, and, being immured in separate dungeons, were left there to ruminate upon the varied and busy scenes in which they had been so lately engaged. Sadly and heavily passed the time, yet days and weeks rolled on ere they again saw the Alcaide. At length, when they had begun almost to despair, they were reconducted to his presence. Do you understand the management of an electrical machine? Asked he abruptly. Certainly, cried the doctor, transported with joy at the question, before Edric, who was half blinded by the sudden change from his gloomy prison to the broad light of day, had sufficiently recovered himself to reply. Then it is in your own power to set yourselves free, continued the Alcaide. The principal general of the army stationed here is ill. A powerful party exists against him who wishes death, at the head of whom stands the leader who was the cause of your being taken into custody. The general himself is a mere nonentity, but the opposite party, to which I belong, wish to save his life, as his name affords a sanction under which they can act. He is now ill of a palsy, and has been recommended to try the effects of an electrical shock. A machine has been with difficulty procured in this remote district, but the philosopher of the army being lately dead, and another not having been yet appointed, no one here knows how to apply it. Now, if you say no more, cried the doctor, interrupting him, in a transport of delight, say no more. I see, I comprehend the whole. I shall restore him, and receive my liberty as the reward. Nay more, I shall obtain immortality amongst the Spaniards by the deed. Their poets will sing my fame, and their historians will pause upon the fact. You will undertake it then, said the Alcaide, and, reading an indignant affirmative in the doctor's looks, he led the way to a camp, at a short distance from the village, where the paralytic general was sitting in a kind of throne, placed without his tent, and surrounded by the principal officers of his staff, the electrical machine, a large, clumsy, heavy-looking thing, standing before him. The doctor looked with dismay at this unwieldy apparatus, so different from his own neat, powerful compendium of science, as he was wont to call it, and saw with infinite horror that even its construction was totally different from those he had been accustomed to. His natural vanity and presumption, however, revolted from making this mortifying acknowledgement, particularly after the boasts he had been indulging into the Al-Qaeda, and, relying upon his general knowledge of the principles of science, he walked boldly up to the machine, with as much composure and self-confidence as though he had been accustomed to the management of it all his life. A considerable trepidation, however, crept over him as he examined it and found its movements intricate and complicated in the extreme, and his hands trembled, and a thick film came over his eyes, as he attempted to charge and adjust the cylinder. For the moment, the doctor himself was blinded by the sudden light, and, when he recovered his sight, the first thing that met his eyes was his friend the Al-Qaeda sticking fast by the skirts of his coat in a hedge. For the moment, the doctor himself was blinded by the sudden light, and, when he recovered his sight, the first thing that met his eyes was his friend the Al-Qaeda sticking fast by the skirts of his coat in a hedge. Terrified at the mischief he had done, the first impulse of the learned doctor was to run away, but, notwithstanding the general confusion and dismay, the first intimation he showed of his design, drew around him a crowd of soldiers, like peasants round a mad dog, who seemed to think him as little entitled to mercy as though he had really been one of those unfortunate animals. "Cut him down," cried one, "blow his brains out," shouted another, "chop his head off," screamed a third, and summary punishment would instantly have been inflicted, if the Al-Qaeda, who in the meantime had contrived to extricate himself from his uncomfortable situation, had not interfered. "Villain," cried he, as soon as he had recovered his breath, for being rather fat, he found flying exercise rather too violent to suit his taste. "Is this the manner in which you treat me? Was it for this I brought you to the camp, and would have made your fortune? Wretch that you are! Hanging is too good for you, and impaling alive mercy to what you deserve. Away to prison with him. He merits not a death so easy as you would give him. Carry him back to his dungeon, and let him there await what punishment the Council of State may judge fit for killing a general and frightening an Al-Qaeda out of his senses." "Mercy! Mercy!" screamed the doctor, but his cries were disregarded, and he and Edric were dragged back to prison, deprived of every hope of obtaining forgiveness. Sadly and silently passed the hours in this gloomy abode, for, though the doctor and his pupil were now permitted to be together, little communication took place between them, as, though Edric was too good-natured to upbraid his unfortunate companion, yet it was past the power of human nature not to feel enraged at the folly that had drawn them into so disagreeable a situation. The poor doctor, however, needed not to be upbraided, for the reproaches of his own conscience were more bitter than any Edric could have lavished on him. "I am lost," cried he, "ruined, and utterly undone. Not only my body will perish miserably, but my fame, my immortal fame is destroyed. Oh! I shall go distracted." In this manner he lamented, wringing his hands and tearing his hair, whilst Edric felt too angry to attempt to console him. "Speak to me, Edric, dear," cried the poor doctor at last, quite in despair at his silence. "For heaven's sake, speak to me. Do let me hear the sound of some voice, besides my own and that of those cursed Spaniards. Oh, Edric! Edric! Solitary confinement is quite enough to drive a man distracted, but to have a companion in such a place as this, and he to refuse to speak. Oh, Edric! Edric! Your heart must be turned to stone, if you can resolve to use me so cruelly." Edric was moved by the doctor's sorrow. "What do you wish me to say?" asked he, smiling. "Oh, now that's like yourself," cried the poor doctor, bursting into tears, and throwing his arms round Edric's neck, whilst he sobbed upon his shoulder like a child. "Now I shall die happy. I don't care what they do to me, I am quite ready for anything that may happen." Edric was affected by the doctor's manner, and returning his embrace warmly, he could not restrain his own tears. "Oh! My dear, dear Edric," cried the doctor, "how I love you! Would to heaven I could save you! I would not care for myself. And I would not accept of liberty without you, my dear tutor, I assure you," returned Edric. "No, no. The perils we have undergone together have added new force to the ties that formerly united us, and our fate now, be it good or ill, shall be the same. It is possible, however, that there may be some means of escape. Alas! No, said the doctor mournfully, seeing Edric look round at the walls and windows. This is the same dungeon I have been so long confined in, and not even a mouse could get out of it without the keeper's permission. What is to be done, then? Cried Edric. Returned the doctor, what, indeed? However, it is certainly a great comfort to have a companion in one's misery, and though my prospects are certainly not much improved since you joined me, my cares are lessened at least one half. Oh! My poor father, exclaimed Edric. The hardest part of my fate seems to die without obtaining his forgiveness. Alas! If he could see me now, he would surely repent his ill-timed severity. Fain would I also know what has passed in England since we left it, if Edmund be married, and if Claudia still reigns. It was spring when we left England, it is now winter, alas! Alas! How many changes this brief space of time may have produced. If, however, my father's life has been spared, I care not for the rest. How little did we anticipate, said the doctor, when we first proposed to travel, the misfortunes that were to attend us. Alas! They seem a just punishment for our crime, in presuming to wish to pry into secrets never intended to be revealed to man. Can you believe it, returned Edric, but in spite of all the misfortunes I have suffered, a restless curiosity to know the fate of the mummy we so strangely resuscitated, is one of the strongest feelings in my bosom. I can readily credit it, said the doctor, for the same feeling operates upon me. It is, however, vain to indulge in useless regrets. We must die, and all we have to do, is to endeavor to become resigned to our fate.